When it comes to video game soundtracks, the ones that have generally stuck out to me the most over the years are the ones that involve licensed music. From Guitar Hero to Grand Theft Auto to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and maybe even one of the 200 FIFA games, chances are you've heard quite a bit of at least one particular licensed video game soundtrack in your life. But even some of your favourite licensed soundtracks probably have a couple of songs that you look back on and think, who? Or there is one licensed video game soundtrack, however, that is close to perfect for me. Yes, I found a way to talk about SSX on this channel too. There is no escape. Don't worry though, this is a music channel, so the main focus of the video is, of course, music. And the music of SSX3 brings a mix of electronica, hip-hop, and alternative rock, with some songs even crossing over two of those styles a bit. Even as a kid that wasn't sure that I even liked hip-hop at all, this entire soundtrack just banged regardless. I got way too excited when I started hearing Jerk It Out or Paralyzer by Finger 11 on the radio, mainly just because I knew of those bands from this game. On revisiting SSX3 as an adult, the soundtrack definitely holds up for the most part. So eventually I was like, why don't I look up every album that the songs in this game appear on and listen to all of them. And that's why I'm reviewing 31 albums in this single video here. Some albums that I'd first heard quite a while ago, others that I expect I would have eventually come around to listening to anyways, and then there's the Black Eyed Peas. And the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Look, maybe you like Black Eyed Peas and or Red Hot Chili Peppers, but the key thing is, I don't. Now there's 35 songs on the main SSX3 soundtrack, but like I said, I'm only covering 31 albums. That's because firstly, Screw Up by Overseer, the most prominent song in the entire game, isn't actually on Overseer's sole album Wreckage, despite what the game says. Or what Overseer himself says. Sorry, Mr. Rob Overseer, previously known as Dr. Chug, currently known as Fatlandic, and I guess also still known as Overseer because you released a song under that name just last year. Unless you officially reissue Wreckage with Screw Up included on the track list before I upload this video, then I'm not going to be talking about it. I did still listen to the album though. It's actually pretty good. I also won't be reviewing Dan the Automator because, long story short, Bear Witness 3 was set to appear on an album, but the label that was going to put it out got swallowed up by Geffen, so it didn't release in 2003 as originally planned, and Dan moved on from the album, so it'll probably never get released at this point. But if you want more stuff a little bit like this, then check out the debut Gorillaz album and the Deltron 3030 self-titled album, because they're both produced or co-produced by Dan the Automator, and they are classics. Lastly, the songs Buffet of Breaks by Johnny Morgan and Avalanche by Power Plant don't have corresponding albums because they were made for SSX3 specifically. And that's fine by me because I don't think there's really anything else worth saying about those two songs. I put the albums in this video in order of how likely you'd probably remember the related song from this game. And there might be a reason why you remember some songs in this soundtrack more than others. Turns out, some of these songs aren't programmed to play during races at all, only during either freestyle and backcountry events or just freestyle events alone. So the albums I'm starting with are the ones that have a song that can play during any event, and then the albums later on are the ones that have the songs that play in the game less often. Beyond that, I've sorted the albums roughly in order of how often I personally remember hearing each related song in the game. So we start with the song that I've definitely heard the most in this game, to the point that I'm amazed it hasn't completely ruined the song for me. I'm talking about Way Away by Yellowcard.
Hey, what's up? This is Yellowcard. You're listening to EA Radio Big.
Yellowcard formed in Jacksonville, Florida, the city that also gave the world Limp Bizkit, the Space Jam theme song. Lynyrd Skynyrd formed there as well. Wait, they're not from Alabama? The band's early history is a little bit murky, with only 2 of the current members being involved with the band since the 90s. And they aren't even founding members. They were just guests on the first Yellowcard album. Yes, that is their debut album. It's not available on streaming services. Not really sure why. Anyways, before they became the Yellowcard of Theseus, we had 2003's Ocean Avenue, their major label debut. This single album has pretty much established their whole legacy. I mean, they've released 6 albums since this one. Could you name any of those following albums? I couldn't. Well, I could now because I've looked them up. Also, one of them self-titled. It was reassuring for me to find out that not only is Way Away the opening track of the album, but the second track is Breathing, a song that I'd also already heard on the soundtrack of another classic EA game, Burnout 3. So the album immediately kicks off with 2 bangers, and then we get the title track, which I'd also heard in the past, and it's not as good as Way Away or Breathing, but is also familiar to me and is still pretty decent. If it wasn't already clear from those first 3 songs, this album is generally labelled as pop punk. and I generally consider pop punk to be good for a handful of epic sing-alongs, and then a whole lot of other middle-of-the-road stuff that's at best middle of the road, and at worst, Machine Gun Kelly. I'm not saying that Yellowcard are worse than MGK, because they definitely aren't, but when I first heard the rest of Ocean Avenue, I was definitely feeling more of the middle-of-the-road vibe overall. Then when I heard the album a second time, I was still aware of its flaws, but suddenly, they didn't really bother me all that much. Granted, even with the typical over-compressed pop-punk mixing, I did feel like there were a couple of surprisingly heavy riffs on the album. And throughout the whole thing, the drums are getting absolutely pummeled by a guy with one of the coolest names I've ever seen. Longinu W. Parsons III. That's his real name. Fucking A. So those two things alone already put it above most of the pop-punk that I've heard, whilst lyrically, the album is as straightforward as I'd expect from an album like this, but the directness helps things feel more sincere, so I have immense respect for this album, even if I do still have critiques about it. My biggest critique is that I'm not really sold on the track 1 Year 6 Months, or the track Miles Apart, and maybe not Inside Out as much either, but that's a big improvement from being unsure about every song except the ones that I'd already heard before on first listen. I don't know if it was because I was in a slightly worse mood when I first listened to this album, or maybe I just managed to stop overthinking it enough to just embrace the sugary, melodic goodness. That's what pop-punk tends to feel like to me. Like sugar. If it hits right, it hits hard, but too much of it can get sickening. This might not get me to listen to any of the other Yellowcard albums, but Ocean Avenue might just be the right amount of pop-punk for me. Oh look, it's the famous 3 Peaks from SSX3. I'm going to use this as my tier list for the albums I'm reviewing here. So if you're going to be giving any of these albums that I talk about a listen, then it should at least be the ones that I put in Peak 3. Top half of Peak 2 is also very great, bottom half of Peak 2 is decent, and Peak 1 is for albums that aren't necessarily bad, but I wouldn't expect to ever bring them up in conversation like, hey, you should listen to this album. With Ocean Avenue, I initially thought this was going to be no higher than Peak 1, but after my change of heart, while it still has its faults, I think it deserves to be at least in the bottom half of Peak 2. Next up, we have an album with a song that I also heard a hell of a lot in this game, but one that I never got particularly sick of at all.
Time now for some hassle-free, low-fat, one-of-a-kind Chemical Brothers. Just right, with no complications.
Tom Rollins and Ed Simons, sadly not actual brothers, began DJing together in the early 90s, originally as the Dust Brothers. But the American production duo of the same name soon caught wind of these English brothers and forced them to change their name. Had these guys never heard Paul's Boutique? Well, it seems like they had, because they apparently call themselves the Dust Brothers as an homage to the actual Dust Brothers. What did they expect was going to happen? On an unrelated note, I'm going to be playing a live show this weekend with my new band, Radiohead. The Chemical Brothers alluded to their forced name change in the title of their 1995 debut album, Exit Planet Dust. I'm not sure why this one song from 1995 is in a soundtrack of songs generally from 2001 at the earliest, but when the song in question rips this hard, who cares? Exit Planet Dust hits you with multiple tracks of shuffling drum beats, thick bass grooves, and distorted synth leads, characteristic of the style that came to be known as Big Beat, a tag also given to Fatboy Slim and The Prodigy. It's also hard to describe that very good Overseer album that I won't be talking about anymore. But the second half of this album also starts to explore a more psychedelic approach. So most of the tracks towards the end of Exit Planet Dust are mellower, aside from Life is Sweet, which is rave rock befitting of a duo from Manchester, which had an entire scene of bands combining alternative rock with dance music at the turn of the decade. Prior to that track, featuring Tim Burgess, lead singer of the Charlatans, the only vocals on the album are short shouts, looped spoken phrases, the ghostly wail on Song to the Siren, and the vocal loop on One Too Many Mornings that may as well be wordless. The brothers could have made a great album even if the use of vocals was limited throughout the whole thing, but Life is Sweet and the melancholic final track Alive Alone, featuring folk singer Beth Orton, see the duo seeking to create memorable music for people that aren't necessarily dance floor freaks. Getting into this album was a long time coming for me, because I've always loved Hey Boy Hey Girl, even back when I only really knew it as the Here We Go song. I also first heard the song Galaxy Bounce on the CD soundtrack for the Tomb Raider movie, but it didn't really sink in just how brilliantly off the wall that song is until I heard the fourth Chemical Brothers album that it's from. That album also includes Star Guitar, another song that I've loved for ages. Surrender might be my favourite of theirs, but Exit Planet Dust is potentially becoming at least my second favourite Chemical Brothers album. It's just been getting better and better with every listen. So this right here is going to be our first Peak 3 album. The brothers did in fact work it out. Next up, we have the first local band on the soundtrack, hailing from Burlington near Toronto. Well, the game was actually produced in Vancouver, so it's local as in from the same country, and that's about it.
Here's some Finger 11 to add to that mountain experience you're all enjoying right now.
Lead singer Scott Anderson provided an explanation of what the name Finger 11 means, but I don't really buy it, because I'm not sure if this explanation even makes that much sense, and also, their first album under that name was called Tip. I think this might just be a dick joke. Either way, it's an improvement over the band's previous name, Rainbow Butt Monkeys. Rainbow Butt Monkeys. They kept that name for 7 years, and even released a full album as Rainbow Butt Monkeys. Thankfully, this self-titled album is under their better-known name. It's the band's 4th album, and typically when a band does a self-titled album later in their career, it suggests that the band have truly found themselves. Like they're saying, this is the album that should define us. So what is the definitive Finger 11 sound, according to this album? Well, it's like Alice in Chains, but with no more than 75% of the musical heaviness, and an overall vibe closer to angst than depression. Also with a little bit of Tool thrown in there, but just a little bit. So this album doesn't try to hide its influences too much, though I don't think Finger 11 were directly trying to emulate any particular bands. If anything, the band that they're ripping off here the most is themselves, because The Last Scene of Struggling has a riff that reminds me a hell of a lot of the main riff from Stay in Shadow.
The one that goes
so cold that you cannot cope.
No, man, you're thinking of
Through your revelation.
Lead guitarist James Black has some neat little tones and tricks up his sleeve, but he doesn't really get many opportunities to show them. And Scott Anderson is a perfectly listenable singer, but his performances don't come with all that much character to them. That can pretty much describe these songs overall. Perfectly listenable, but not a whole lot of character. There are songs on this album that I would potentially come back to though. For one, Good Times is genuinely iconic. I also previously heard Stay in Shadow on the Burnout 3 soundtrack, and I wasn't a huge fan of it for a while, but it's probably my second favourite track on here now. Absent Elements is another decent track, Obvious Heart is a strong album closer, and 1,000 Mile Wish is one of the mellower and better cuts on the album. I can't really say the same about One Thing, which is the band's only #1 hit in Canada, and their most successful single in the US until Paralyzer came along. But to me, One Thing is a by-the-numbers acoustic ballad that has a decent chorus, but otherwise just sounds unfinished to me. The lyrics certainly read like a first draft, like not just rhyming time with time, but then immediately rhyming no with no, twice. And just looking at this music video, you probably don't even have to be told that they did in fact open for Creed on a tour last year. I would personally rate Finger 11 much higher than Creed, but probably isn't really saying much, is it? Finger 11's self-titled is unfortunately going to be the first Peak 1 album. The harshest adjective I'd be willing to use for it is inessential. But if you love Good Times and or Stay in Shadow, then you should find at least some other stuff on here that you'd like. Now let's see how our first foray into hip-hop goes.
Yeah, straight from the X-Ecutioners, Grandmaster Rock Raider, and you're listening to EABIG.
The X-Ecutioners started out as a DJ crew called the X-Men. Obviously that's a name they couldn't keep for too long, and they also lost several founding members over the years, so by 2002 they were down to a trio of... That year they released their most successful single, It's Going Down, featuring Linkin Park's Mike Shinoda and that band's own turntablist Joe Hahn. After the third X-Ecutioners album Revolutions, the trio largely went their separate ways until 2008, when they collaborated on an album under a different name, then announced a reunion tour under their better-known name. Sadly, Rock Raider passed away just a year later, and the history section for the X-Ecutioners on Wikipedia ends abruptly there. Not even on a full sentence. However, the X-Ecutioners name does still appear to be active, albeit with a co-founding member that wasn't involved on Revolutions, and 2 members that only joined after that album. DJ Total Eclipse isn't even involved in this performance, but that might be because he apparently lives in Australia now. That's cool. Rob Swift has talked about the pressures that the X-Ecutioners faced to become more of a rap rock group after the success of It's Going Down, and 2004's Revolutions may reflect some of that pressure, particularly on the remix of More Human Than Human by White Zombie featuring Rob Zombie himself. And there are other songs on this album driven by guitars and various live instruments, but also plenty of more straight hip-hop tracks, featuring MCs from the Wu-Tang Clan, The Roots, and Cypress Hill. Anyway, what's it like to actually listen to Revolutions? Well, it's decent. I did get a little bit tired of hearing Like This in SX3 constantly, but it's still a pretty good track. Another good one is Get With It featuring Cypress Hill that makes me think I should start properly listening to Rage Against the Machine, because it reminds me of them a lot at times and it goes hard as hell. Towards the end of the album, the song featuring Dead Prez and following track The Truth bring more of a gangster rap flavour with their aggressive verses and more electronic production. For some reason, when I go to stream this album, The Truth isn't available in my region, which is annoying because those are two of my favourite songs of this album overall. Then there's a few tracks without any featured vocalists, which I suppose are the more turntable-based tracks, but they tend to not be as memorable as the rest. Though with multiple sub 3 minute long tracks, including 4 skits, Revolutions clocks in at just over 50 minutes, so it's never felt like much of a slog to listen to. The album brings a large variety of energetic beats and raps without coming off too disjointed to me. It's certainly not the most memorable hip hop album I've heard, but I reckon it's still good enough for a modest spot on Peak 2. Now we come to another electronic duo from merry old England. This time it's Basement Jaxx.
This particular tune is perfect for riding for. Here's Basement Jaxx.
Basement Jaxx were partly named after the Chicago house tradition of jacking, which described both a common dance move amongst house fans and an early variation of the music itself. So whilst they first rose to prominence in the late 90s when other notable big beat artists were hitting their peak, the Jaxx weren't afraid to get a little more old-fashioned, dabbling with electro-funk, disco and R&B influences. The London duo already had 2 top 5 singles in the UK off their debut album, but I think it was after they dropped their second album that they really started to get attention internationally. Now I don't know if the name Rooty has the same potential double meaning in the UK as it would here in Australia, but if it doesn't then it would still make sense because this is a pretty damn horny album. Do Your Thing is certainly an exception to that, and it was always one of my lesser favourite SSX3 songs, but I found that I don't really dislike it. I guess I just prefer it a bit more in moderation. Where's Your Head At also isn't one of the tracks that puts the root in Rooty, and I grew up constantly hearing that song as well. I reckon I always at least respected that song, if not outright enjoyed it. But going back to it now, it's an absolute ripper. It also probably would have worked better on the SSX3 soundtrack, but that's neither here nor there. But also Do Your Thing is Kari Nishidaki's podium theme song, so I take it back, it's actually the greatest song of all time. Where's Your Head At is probably the most overtly big beat song on Rooty, which generally blends the sophistication of French house with the playfulness and sensuality of US house. Basement Jaxx employ various female singers on these tracks, providing fully fleshed out vocal parts rather than just 1 or 2 looped lines. So that helps keep these songs memorable even well after you've left the dance floor. Another one of the vocalists on the album is Felix Buxton. That's the half of Basement Jaxx that looks like he could be my uncle. And his vocals usually sound like they've been greatly manipulated, coming off a bit more like a parody of flamboyant early house MCs than an homage. Rudy's best moments tend to come on the singles like Romeo, Just One Kiss, and Where's Your Head At, of course. But that isn't to say that there aren't some good album tracks on here. Plus, clocking in at a comparatively brief 43 minutes, Rudy certainly doesn't overstay its welcome. These guys may have a bit of a warped sense of humour in their music, but make no mistake, they're generally quite serious about creating memorable melodies. And those warped bits keep things from getting too predictable in the end. I would definitely consider Rudy by Basement Jaxx to be a mid to upper Peak 2 album. Now we come to another one of EA Canada's local picks, actually from Vancouver this time. Also, this band name is 100% a dick joke.
Yeah, what's up? This is Prevail from Fallen Members on EA Radio Big. Do your thing!
No, Prevail, that's the song we were just talking about. It's not even your song, buddy. MCs Prevail and Madchild formed Swollen Members in the mid-90s and remain as the ensemble's constant members. Producer Rob the Viking became an official member in 2002, and another prominent on-off member was the rapper/producer Mocha Only, who apparently came up with the group's name. As a joke. Which they went with anyways. The group put out 8 albums over a 15-year period, and based on this reunion tour they did last year, evidently split up at some point. But while Swollen members might technically still be active, most of Prevail and Rob the Viking's focus of late has been on their band XL, the band. And Madchild has mostly been focusing on making it very hard for me to take him seriously. But even with Madchild's future actions in mind, this Utah Saints remix of Deep End still kicks real hard.
Swollen Members now remixed by the Utah Saints, going out by request for Kaori Nishidaki.
Yeah, this is the greatest song of all time. Do You Think is the second best. By the way, the Utah Saints are neither from Utah nor even from America itself. Bloody frauds. Next you'll tell me that they haven't actually been canonized either. I also thought that the original version of Deep End was pretty good when I looked it up out of curiosity a while ago, so I definitely had some optimism going into their second album, Bad Dreams. This album's from 2001, so Rob the Viking wasn't quite an official member yet, but he is involved on this album alongside 8 other producers. The best known of those producers would be The Alchemists. Maybe better known for negative reasons of late.
Shut the fuck up, you!
But I couldn't pick out which of these tracks were produced by The Alchemists just by listening to them, so I guess all of the producers were on a similar wavelength. That gives the beats on this album a good amount of variation without going all over the place. The disadvantage of that is that the beats don't really stand out in general. Some of the beats do stand out to me, in the sense that they sound like a cheap imitation of Deltron 3030. Even though those two albums only came out a year apart, and Bad Dreams also favours more of an old school sample-based approach, the execution here just tends to feel a bit hollow. As for the vocals, Mad Child and Prevail aren't really saying anything important, but I can take or leave that really. They both have a good sense of rhythm, decent lyrical structures, and while Mad Child's delivery feels a bit more forced than Prevail's, he doesn't sound bad per se. To me, their biggest shortcoming is to do with the choruses. Plenty of renowned hip-hop songs have a chorus of repeatedly rapped lines instead of singing. For example, Life's a Bitch by Nas and AZ has been one of my favourite rap hooks of late. However, Prevail and Mad Child don't have an outstanding knack for those kind of hooks at all, and unfortunately, they deliver the majority of the choruses on this album. There are some good hooks on this album though, such as the refrain on Burns and Scars. But guess what? That one isn't delivered by one of the members themselves, but by guest MC Sun Doobie. Fuel Injected has a good chorus as well, but naturally, that one comes from Mocha only instead, with one of the few melodic refrains on the album. Some of the tracks with just Mad Child and Prevail on vocals still work decently, and there's nothing on Bad Dreams that I'd call flat out terrible. It just does what many other rappers and hip hop groups have done far better. I can't really fault them for that too much, but that unfortunately doesn't make the album a whole lot easier to listen to. Compare this to Illmatic by Nas, which has that song that I mentioned earlier. Bad Dreams is nearly half an hour longer than that album. Ultimately, the only genuine standout tracks on Bad Dreams are Deep End, Fuel Injected, and Fuel Injected Remix. I mean, seriously, it has more of an electro-funk feel to it, and I dig that quite a lot. I think a better title for this album would be Disappointing Dreams. And that'll put it in peak 1, I'm afraid. Alright, who are we talking about next?
Kinky.
Oh, that's right, Kinky. Thanks, Hedy Lamar.
That's Headley!
Oh, sorry, Headley.
Hi, this is Ulises from Kinky, so let's get kinky on EA Radio Big.
Kinky are a 5-piece from Monterrey, Mexico. But the guy who signed Kinky to his label and co-produced their debut self-titled album is a guy who just produced a Coldplay EP. So you might not have to be an expert in Mexican music to appreciate this band. Tracks like Bus feature syncopated Latin rhythms and percussion, but the backbone for most of Kinky's debut album is techno pulses with occasional breakbeats. A little closer to that Basement Jaxx album than, say, Santana. Most of the lyrics on here are in Spanish, but even without speaking the language, I get the impression that their main purpose is to just service the grooves. I think the wordiest song in this album is just a faux fitness instruction tape. The track Corn Man was also used in a video game, namely Little Big Planet, and you can hear why they chose it for that. I don't even need to try and explain why, it's so obviously Little Big Planet coded. This is less of an album and more just a general vibe, which may be why I'm already running out of ways to describe the album in more detail. In fact, I've generally listened to the whole thing and not felt like there's a particular track that really jumps out and grabs me, you know? But I still can't bring myself to criticize it otherwise. It's a quirky, peppy, funky little album, and whether it's culturally significant or not doesn't change to me that it's quite a lot of fun. So I wouldn't go too far, but Kinky's self-titled is a peak 2 album for sure. The last thing I say about the album is that it isn't as noticeably risque as the band's name would suggest. Let's move on to an album that should make up for that a little bit.
Oh wow, this is crazy, man. This is Warren Fisher from Fischerspooner, and you're listening to EA Radio Big.
Fischerspooner started off as much as a performance art troupe as it did an electronic duo, but Fisher and Spooner soon garnered plenty of attention for their music, particularly within a hedonistic scene that birthed the genre known as electroclash. My understanding of electroclash is that it's a revival of early 80s synth pop and new wave, but delivered in a rougher, more in-your-face kind of way. The original wave of electroclash died out in the early 2000s, but its influence can still be heard to this day. If you're familiar with The Dare, then yeah, he's pretty much just doing electroclash in the present day. Fund charitable causes that provide clean drinking water for impoverished communities in Africa. And also really like to have sex. Emerge was Fischerspooner's debut single, reaching number 25 in the UK and earning them a performance on the famed chart program Top of the Pops. Naturally, Casey Spooner took the opportunity to strip as close to nude as possible on the show. He does do the same thing during every other live performance of Emerge that I could find, but I think this is the only one where he did it on national TV. Fischerspooner's debut album was apparently supposed to be self-titled, but has eventually come to be known as Number 1. Originally a 9-track album, but now more widely available as a reissue containing 13 tracks. And one of the tracks added later was the Junkie XL remix of Emerge. So this is the only time that I get to hear the remixed version of a song on the SSX3 soundtrack on the album that I'm reviewing for this video. Normally I'm not a fan of putting a remix of a song on the same album as the original song, but in this instance, the two versions contrast each other quite nicely. Junkie XL's remix is a slick, atmospheric track ready-made for a high-end nightclub or a stadium rave, and it's definitely one of my favourite songs in SSX3 overall. By the way, I hadn't realised until recently that Junkie XL is a pretty prominent film composer now. That is a hell of a resume. Meanwhile, Fischerspooner's original version of Emerge is made for a hole-in-the-wall club for people that are still throwing down, even though it's 5:30 in the morning and they're all soaked in sweat. The backbone for most of Fischerspooner's Number 1 is tinny, skittering electro drums and buzzing bass synths playing octave riffs, with the lead synth lines coming in the form of either wormy drones or rapid arpeggiators. And the sound is dirtied up even more by some rogue effects processing, like all the vocal effects on the updated opening track Sweetness, or the yell towards the end of Emerge that goes through almost Aphex Twin window licker levels of sound manipulation. Spooner's flamboyant but often brooding vocals are supplemented by 2 guest female singers, providing harmonies as well as some proper diva performances on the likes of Emerge and album tracks like Turn On. Other tracks like Invisible and Natural Disaster that dial the tempo back a little bit still have a bit of a slinky and flirty feel to them. I couldn't find any footage of Fischerspooner performing Natural Disaster live, but I like to imagine that Spooner would have been performing that song in an Egyptian pharaoh style outfit, because that's totally the vibe I get from that song. Then there's a cover of The 15th by early British art punks Wire, and considering the overall trashy nature of Number 1, this cover stays surprisingly true to the dreamy original. It's kind of like the early 2000s equivalent of a synthwave cover. Like it was pulled from an alternate universe where Soft Cell's big hit was a cover of this song rather than Tainted Love. And going even more against the grain on the album is Tone Poem, with minimal drums and gentle droning chords backing Spooner's half-whispered singing. Maybe I'm getting a little hyperbolic, but this track is actually pretty damn beautiful. Certainly more beautiful than I'd expect from an album with a song on it called Fucker, and then updated to include a song about taking a fat shit. Yes, really. You've been warned. Plus, I don't have a problem with this album cover like some people do, but it's not exactly high art, is it? But I don't need high art. All I need is something that sounds good, looks good, and feels good too. Oh, well, actually, it doesn't really look good, is it? Because it's music. You can't really look at music. Over time, people haven't really taken Fischerspooner that seriously, which may have been somewhat intentional on their part, but I don't think you get to collaborate with the likes of David Byrne, Michael Stipe, and Caroline Polachek, unless you're somewhat dedicated towards songwriting. Plus, they listen to Wire, so clearly they know a thing or two about great music. Beneath the sleazy, chaotic veneer, Number 1 boasts some serious earworms. It's absolutely worth coming back to, and I also recommend the second Fischerspooner album, which is a little more refined than Number 1, but still far better than it has any right to be. Number 1 doesn't quite live up to its title because I wouldn't say it's the best album out of all of these, but it's certainly up there on peak 3. That's right. Now, for the soundtrack to a snowboarding game, it surely doesn't get much more fitting than an electronic duo from the Arctic Circle. They hail from Tromsø in Norway, and they call themselves Röyksopp. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think it's actually a Norwegian word, so I don't know. There isn't a whole lot of backstory to these guys. You know, they're 2 childhood friends that formed an electronic duo, gained attention pretty quickly, and while they're not a household name, they've certainly done well for themselves. I mean, isn't that the guy from Overwatch? The pair released their debut single in 1999, then their debut album, Melody AM, followed 2 years later. The album also contains the song Apple, a song that I've loved since I first came across it in high school. So between that and Paulino, I don't know why it took me until the last year or two to listen to the rest of Melody AM, but boy, I'm glad that I finally did. This album is more on the down-tempo trip-hop side compared to the other electronic albums that I'll be covering in this video, but the songs are still driven by some pretty funky rhythms. Big beat producers tended to just take old drum breaks and loop them in their songs without rearranging them too much, but on Melody AM, it sounds like Röyksopp took one drum break, put the individual drum hits into a sampler, and built new, busier rhythms with it. The album has 3 songs with full original vocal parts, making vocals slightly more prominent on this album than on Exoplanet Dust. 2 of those songs are sung by fellow Norwegian Erlend Øye, who fronts a band called Whitest Boy Alive, and I don't think you can get a more fitting name for a Norwegian band than that. Melody AM maintains the same character throughout whilst covering a decent spectrum of sounds and moods, from the gentler, more classical arrangement of In Space, to the clattering drums and fuzzier bass on A Higher Place. Tracks like In Space, as well as So Easy and She's So, are built around more old-fashioned samples, making the album feel of the past and futuristic at the same time, like the audio equivalent of liminal space. But the first adjective in the Wikipedia summary of Röyksopp's music is warm, and that is the prevailing feeling that I get from Melody AM. It's warm, it's groovy, it's slightly eerie, and it's got the kind of bleeping, shimmering, and warping synthesizers that might just tickle your brain. I don't know if I have any more words that could do this album justice. It definitely belongs in a higher place, namely Peak 3. Now just quickly think back to when you first booted up this game. And, well, firstly, you got jump scared by Razel shouting and THX's loudest jingle in the universe. But after that, you had DJ Atomica setting the scene in the ultimate snowboarding paradise, soundtracked by the sweeping strings, burbling bass, and pumping drums of Go by Andy Hunter. And all of a sudden, life was good.
The tunes are kicking, you're kicking. This is Andy Hunter, and you're listening to EA Radio Big.
Many of the songs in this game can feel euphoric when combined with the awesome gameplay experience, but with this particular song, there could be another reason for that euphoria. Because unbeknownst to me, and maybe you as well, Go by Andy Hunter is a Christian song. And I just thought that Andy might have called the album Exodus because he just thought it was a word that sounded cool. But no, it's named after the second book of the Bible. Andy Hunter, or Andy Hunter Degrees as he credits himself for some reason, is a Christian DJ that makes Christian music. Though the bio on his old website refers to him combining dance music and spiritual faith without alienating the former or tainting the latter. Case in point, whilst Hunter's music has appeared in Dance Praise, it also featured in SSX3 and many other forms of media not directly tied to Christianity. In fact, I probably don't even need to bring up Christianity when talking about this album. I just thought it would be interesting to bring up, especially if you're always like, yeah, I don't listen to Christian music. Newsflash, asshole! You've been hearing it this entire goddamn time! Going into this album, it wasn't the Christianity that worried me. It was the fact that, like that Swollen Members album, this thing is an absolute unit. But listening to Exodus is a bit like getting into a swimming pool. You might initially be a little hesitant to go all the way in, but once you're fully immersed, it feels fine. Fine is about as far as I'd go to describe Exodus, and honestly I think I'd rather go to a swimming pool than listen to this. That isn't to say that Exodus is bad at all, more that you'll just know what you're in for after the first few songs. But it is still somewhat varied, with plenty of lights flashing as everyone on the dance floor raises their hands kind of moments, but also some less intense and more reflective passages. There's a few tracks on the album with guest vocals, including a Christian rapper, but none of these vocalists feel like they really add anything significant to the music. Ultimately, I'd say that the most interesting vocalist on the album is Andy Hunter Degrees himself, because he isn't the most technically gifted singer on here, but he's the one with the most character, such as on Radiate, where he sings with a sneering swagger that would make someone like Shawn Ryder proud. There's also a voice sample on track Strange Dream that suddenly gets stretched and sped up like a YouTube poop edit.
A strange and funny dream. A strange and funny dream.
And the album also mixes various drum breaks in with the standard 4 on the floor house music pulse. So that keeps things from getting significantly stale here. I think Go might be comfortably ahead of all of the other tracks on Exodus, but there's enough to like about the album that I'd feel harsh not putting it at least in the bottom half of Peak 2. I don't have a segue written for this one. Next band.
When I'm carving it up, I'm listening to Autopilot Off, and now so are you.
New York pop-punk band Autopilot Off released their debut album in 2000, though at that time they were known by a different name. Yeah. Now I found an interview with Autopilot Off's bassist Rob Kucharek, and he says they got that name from a Dukes of Hazzard character, who was named after a turtle. So it's not funny! But then they got sued by an older band from Mississippi, who also clearly loves turtles. And Rob says that it was a bit of a joke name that they came up with in high school, so they didn't really mind having to change it after all. Anyways, Make a Sound was Autopilot Off's major label debut, but it remains as their last album to date, with the band going on hiatus the year after its release. They have been sporadically active over the last decade, which is good to hear because I only wish the best for these guys. I mean, look at them, they're so unassuming. And two of them are called Chris. It doesn't get much more down to earth than that, surely. Like with the Yellowcard album, Make a Sound's first two tracks are a song that appeared in Burnout 3 and the song from SSX3. This whole track is pretty good, but Clockwork is on a whole other level.
This is a certified hood.
Like me, if you'd only heard those two Autopilot Off songs already, then you more or less know what you're getting into with the rest of the Make a Sound album. Autopilot Off's main strength is in writing strong hooky choruses. This is certainly apparent in the album's one official single, What I Want. First time I heard it I was like, I don't know about this. But now it's like, get it out of my head! Although, not in a terrible way, you know? There's also hints of a broader alternative rock sound, such as the guitars having a grittiness to them rather than just sheer volume. And the track I Know You're Waiting sounding like it could have been written for Weezer's Green album. Ultimately though, they're a little more than just hits, with the band settling for more direct and formulaic songwriting. It sounds like they were trying to go for a bit of added depth in the lyrics, but they generally fall in a dead zone between simplicity and complexity that make them rarely stick out. There are a couple of other good tracks on the album, such as the stripped back Divine Intervention and closing track The Cicadas song, but while I wouldn't say there's a bad song on this album by any means, some of them are much less identifiable than others. So despite my initial impressions, I've ultimately gotten a bit more out of the Yellowcard album than this one. So I think I'm going to have to put Autopilot Off on peak 1. It's still a mostly worthwhile album. I just think I'm going to run out of room on peak 2, and it's lacking in some departments.
Let's go.
We just got a request from SSX Powerhouse, Nate Logan. The man wants some Caesars, and here they are.
Caesars are a band from Sweden, where they're still known by their original name of Caesar's Palace, and their first 3 albums were almost exclusively released in Sweden alone. 39 Minutes of Bliss in an otherwise meaningless world, false advertising, was their first album to be distributed worldwide. It was actually a compilation of songs from those first 3 albums. So this is the only time that a song in SSX3 is credited to a compilation rather than a standard studio album. Though I did also listen to the original album that this appeared on, which was 2002's Love for the Streets. Now many of the selected songs on 39 Minutes of Bliss filter the garagey sounds of the 60s through a modern lens, with scrappy guitars, fuzzed out organs, ragged vocals complemented by fantastic harmonies, and production soaked in reverb and echo. A few songs on the compilation show more of the band's lighter and trippier side, but this appears to have been a ploy to try and put Caesars more in line with the other garage rock bands that were exploding at the time. Now not only did Caesars never particularly sound like the garage rock bands that were big in 2003, but half of the compilation is tracks from their debut album, which originally released 6 years earlier, and had already been released in the US! And Jerk It Out is the only song on here that represents their latest album at the time. That song already isn't on the same level of brattiness as older Caesar songs like Sorted Out and You're My Favourite, but the other songs on Love for the Streets are even less representative of that. So yeah, great strategy. Let's introduce this band to the rest of the world by showing everyone what they used to sound like. As you can probably tell, this marketing move largely didn't pay off. I guess the world just wasn't ready for a song that opens with the line. Nowadays you hear a line like that in every second hyperpop song. The promotion of Jerk It Out did pay off, however. Then it paid off even more 2 years later when Apple put it in an iPod commercial. So then they put it on their next album as well. That didn't really pay off either, because that just sort of upgraded them from that crappy band to that crappy iPod band. But after listening to all of Caesars' albums, I'd say they got a pretty raw deal. Love for the Streets is about 75% of the reason I went and listened to that other stuff, because it is bloody fantastic. This album is also fantastic, as is this album. This one's also got some killer songs on it. And this album is not bad. Now in terms of my album ranking, I'm going to use 39 Minutes of Bliss because that's what Jerk It Out is credited to in SSX3. Although that compilation is pretty obsolete now that you can play every original Caesars album at the click of a button. But it's a damn fine selection of songs regardless. Since that song also appears on a main Caesar studio album, I guess I could technically count this entry as both of those albums combined. But either way, This is peak 3 as fuck. I might even end up making a standalone video about Caesars just to go over their music in more detail, because I definitely think more people should listen to this stuff. And I might never have listened to it myself if it wasn't for SSX3. Though as I mentioned at the start of the video, I had heard Jerk It Out in other places throughout the years. That's more than I can say about this next song.
There's a little Deepsky coming your way, from my turntable to your eardrums.
Deepsky is an LA-based electronic act formed by Jason Bloom and J. Scott G in the mid-90s. The bulk of the duo's output over the years appears to have been remixes, but they did put out originals such as Tempest, which became the theme song for MTV's electronica program AMP, and also the tracks that make up their 2002 debut album In Silico. J. Scott G left Deepsky in the mid-2000s, and I think Bloom put out some new songs under the Deepsky name by himself, but it appears the newest original song under that name came out in 2007. Deepsky's website is still up though, so I guess the project hasn't officially been retired yet, though In Silico remains the only full-length Deepsky album to date. Now Ride is an iconic song from SSX3 for sure. The steady hypnotic pulse and reverberating synths are a perfect match for carving up the slopes and hurtling down the ice. I just wish I'd never looked up the lyrics, cause... Anyway, that song, and many of the others on In Silico, remind me of the song Don't Give Up by British producer Chicane, another electronic artist whose music is often labelled as trance. Don't Give Up is a song that I've always quite liked since I initially heard it on the radio. However, whilst I don't mind the full 8.5-minute version of it, this is one of the times where I'd say that the radio edit is more than enough. And this Deepsky album probably could have used a few radio edits. Only 2 of the 11 tracks clock under 6 minutes, with the whole thing being 73 minutes overall. And it sure feels that long. That Andy Hunter album from earlier is only 3 minutes shorter than this one, but the thought of re-listening to Exodus doesn't make me feel uneasy like with this one. In Silico feels a little too busy to be a proper chill-out record, but not mentally stimulating enough to be a properly interesting progressive dance album. It's basically just wallpaper in the greyest shade of grey that you'll ever see. I'm going to keep this segment fairly brief, otherwise I'm worried I'll start getting too mean towards it. Because I'm not suggesting that Deepsky's In Silico is a poorly made album. It certainly isn't. It's just that outside of Ride and maybe 3 or 4 of the other tracks, this is just aggressively not for me. I didn't have a segue planned for this next band either. Beep boop. Yeah, there's your segue.
How about a little I'm a Robot, people? Yeah? Yeah, I thought so. Here we go.
For many years, A is for Action was the only thing I'd heard from I'm a Robot, but I do remember the song Home by Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros being a bit of an underground hit a while back. Turns out, Edward Sharpe was the alter ego of I'm a Robot's lead singer, Alex Ebert. Each member of I'm a Robot on this first album ended up going on to pretty big things. Ebert won a Golden Globe for his original score to the film
All Is Lost.
Guitarist Timmy Anderson and keyboardist Oliver Goldstein have co-written and co-produced songs for some pretty big names. Joey Waronker is probably the guy that every famous artist calls when they need a drummer at short notice. He's touring with Oasis at the moment. And Justin Meldon Johnson has kept busy as both a sideman and an in-demand producer for popular alternative acts. Him and Waronker were also the rhythm section for Beck at the time. Also, Waronker's band prior to I'm a Robot? Just a little group called REM. A is for Action shows us that these people are certainly capable of making fun music together. And the album also opens with 2 other hyperactive punky tracks. But the track song number 1 is actually the second track because Get Bent! And then the next 2 tracks are quite slow. Alright. Then we have A is for Action, and that's followed by an impersonation of mid-80s Talking Heads. So the biggest flaw of this album is that the track-by-track flow is like Whiplash. Maybe it would have been better with more of an LCD sound system kind of approach, where you have the dance punk track, and then you have one of the 70s glam art rock pastiches, and then you keep alternating between the 2. The only track I maybe don't care for all that much is Dirty Life, because I already don't care about Talking Heads' later songs that much, and I certainly don't want to hear anyone else trying to do them. Instrumentally, this album is pretty killer. Creative guitar layers, colourful synths, some pretty tasty bass licks, and dude is smashing those drums. The performances probably helped to mask the album's weaker songwriting elements, like the track Scream, which I'd say is a rare example of a great song where the chorus is the least interesting part. Beyond the strange sequencing, the album's main weak spot is Alex Ebert. He is a decent enough singer, but on every song he's singing like like, does this guy even know the meaning of the word subtlety? Plus, the only lyrics of his that really stand out are vaguely anti-capitalist humour that doesn't quite land, and stuff like A is for Action, where the moral appears to be, the world's gonna end soon, so why bother fighting? Like, why would I take this guy's opinion on the upcoming apocalypse, when he literally can't even spell the word? Of course, that stuff's a little bit lame, but certainly not unforgivable. Although, 12 equals 3, Here Come the Doctors sounds like a song that RFK Jr. would have come up with if he ever tried his hand at music. So Ima Robot's self-titled is a bit spotty, but not bad by any means. Dynamite and song number 1 were always pretty great. Let's Talk Turkey is a slower track that I pretty much enjoyed from the get-go. Here Come the Bombs shifts to Devo levels of new wave weirdness, and What Are We Made From is both the biggest homage to Ziggy Stardust era Bowie on the album, and a pretty solid closing track. But Ebert was never going to be the next Bowie, as much as he may have wanted to be. Instead, if the bonus track Black Jetters is anything to go by, his real destiny was to be the next Peaches.
Sucking on my titties.
Ima Robot's self-titled is still going to go in peak 2, maybe just under the Yellowcard album, because that one has a little bit more consistency than this one. Up next...
Am I excited? Do you want to see? How's that for exciting?
What a jovial fellow. I sure hope he doesn't start randomly punching on with his bandmates one day.
Gonna hit you up right now with a wicked track from Jane's Addiction.
Jane's Addiction were founded way back in 1985 by singer Perry Farrell and bassist Eric Avery, soon joined by guitarist Dave Navarro and drummer Stephen Perkins. The band only put out 2 studio albums in their heyday, but those albums are still highly praised by critics and musicians alike. Their debut album, Nothing Shocking, was co-written by all 4 members, yet Farrell somehow managed to get nearly 2/3 of the band's share of royalties for himself alone. So I reckon it's a miracle that they even made more than one album together, let alone taking nearly 40 years to break up for good. During their second reunion, minus Avery, who apparently wrote a lot of the music on Nothing Shocking himself, Jane's Addiction dropped their third album, Strays. And already being a fan of their earlier work, I went into this album with no hesitation at all. It's interesting to me that Jane's Addiction are widely considered to be the first truly massive alternative band, with a guitarist looking and playing like he was practicing for a Motley Crue audition, and a singer with the vocal range of Axl Rose and just as much of the ego, though less risk of suddenly beating someone up in the audience. He just does that to his bandmates instead. Joking aside, this is not the behaviour of a man who's in good health. Please just retire and get all the help that you need, Perry. And he's going to be performing again at the end of this month. I'm scared now. I reckon the main thing that set Jane's Addiction apart from bands like Guns N' Roses was greater musical ambition. Take a song like 3 Days from their second and best album Ritual de lo Habitual, where the quieter passages are more psychedelic and kind of gothic. Then when the metallic riffs come in, they feel quite cathartic. Meanwhile, when Guns N' Roses did longer songs like November Rain, it basically just switched between hard rock and soft rock. I also feel like Jane's delivered the more old-fashioned elements of their sound a bit more playfully. Not without sincerity, but with a wry smile and a cheeky little wink, you know? It might sound like I'm trying a bit too hard to justify why I like Jane's Addiction, and maybe that is what I'm doing, but it does lead into my first major point about Strays. To me, this doesn't feel all that far removed from their first 2 albums. Despite a lot of familiar songwriting, you can hear the band's sound adapting for the 21st century as well, like they weren't afraid to sound a bit more digital than they had before. Hypersonic is the biggest example of this, to the point where it sounds hardly like anything else on the album. It's probably the one song on here where Johnny Morgan could replace Stephen Perkins with sampled drum breaks and not have it sound totally out of place. The mixing on Strays can sound a bit flat at times, and the songs aren't quite as engaging when they lean into that funk metal style more, but I'd say that about some of their earlier work as well. It also might not have as much urgency as Nothing Shocking, or the kind of songwriting masterclasses you'd find on Ritual, but I really don't think Strays is all that far behind those previous albums in quality either. Navarro and Perkins give their all as usual, and Farrell could still soar vocally with seemingly little to no effort, but also still doing so with great melodicism. One of the album's biggest strengths is that it doesn't dwell on one thing for too long. Opening track True Nature is partly why the album has gained comparisons to new metal. Then the following title track starts with a very classic Jane-style slow burn, before giving way to an anthemic stadium rocker. Then Price I Pay starts with the kind of guitar line that a post-grunge band might come up with as the crux of a song, but in this song, it drops out and gives way to a grinding fuzz riff from the current touring bassist for AC/DC, and it all just takes off from there. There's even an acoustic ballad on here in the form of Everybody's Friend, and they still pull that off surprisingly well. Basically, if you like the first 2 Jane's Addiction albums, then you definitely should like Strays. And if you don't like it, or you don't like any of those albums, there isn't really much more that I can say to change that. I mean, they're not exactly a difficult band to dislike, I must say. Jane's Addiction are actually the only artist featured in SSX3 that I've seen live in person. It's clear that Perry's voice was already on the decline, but I can assure you that he wasn't this far gone yet. Anyway, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but even as at least a moderate fan, Strays didn't stick out to me too much when I initially heard it. It took a couple of revisits for the band's talents to really shine through for me, and yeah, I maintain that the quality is definitely on here. This is far more than your average lukewarm post-reunion album. Say, Perry's wearing a pretty large hat on that album cover. You know who else is known for wearing large hats? Pharrell Williams.
Hey, this is Pharrell from the Neptunes and NERD. You're listening to EA Radio Big.
NERD is a trio made up of Pharrell and Chad Hugo, who also work as a production duo called the Neptunes, alongside Shay Haley, whose opening Wikipedia paragraph straight up says, "What the hell does this guy even do?" Well, according to Haley himself, he is the band's three-dimensional curator. Glad that we've cleared that up. NERD's debut album In Search Of first dropped in 2001. However, the album was withdrawn after Pharrell and Hugo decided that they wanted the project to be more of a detour from their production work as the Neptunes. So they enlisted a band called Spy Mob to re-record the album's instrumentals and convert In Search Of from a rap album to a rap rock album. Spy Mob give the album a tight and funky instrumental backing, though some tracks involve only 2 or 3 chords, and they don't overall get much of a chance to shine beyond a couple of songs, although the drums are pretty badass all around. Vocally, the album is probably about 70% Pharrell, with guest appearances from Khalees, Pusha T, his brother Malice, and Lee Harvey. Wait, wasn't that the guy who got shot? You know, by Jack Ruby? Pharrell generally switches between gentle crooning and falsetto, and even on tracks like Lap Dance, where he delivers threats to kill, he's sting-rapping at best. The Neptunes would work with Justin Timberlake on his debut album soon after, and with songs like Things Are Getting Better, you could hear that was coming. Pharrell doesn't sound too concerned about conforming with hip-hop's usual standards on here. Not only does he barely rap, but he even sings about being in love, not just about wanting to have sex. That is to say, he also does sing about sex quite a bit. What a romantic. The album's formula is largely set in stone until the last few tracks. Rockstar is the only track where Pharrell truly tries to get in your face, and penultimate track Bobby James is an R&B odyssey, ending on a hidden instrumental coda with saxophone. Then album closer Stay Together combines a psychedelic synth line with stripped back drums that are little more than a pounding snare, sounding like it could have been largely unchanged from the original electronic version of the album. The original version of In Search Of is still floating around out there, though I haven't heard the whole thing. From the original versions that I have heard though, I'm not convinced that the rock version is a significantly different experience to the electronic version, aside from, using different instruments. If you truly want to hear NERD as a rock band, then check out their second album, Fly or Die, which is pretty decent as well. That album came out about 6 months after the release of SSX3, where one of the Monster Trick combos is called NERD Fly or Die. Did Pharrell use this game to officially announce his next album? Based if true, In Search Of has an undeniable swagger that makes up for much of its shortcomings. It's pretty much faultless from a musical standpoint, even if I just call it an okay album overall. But it's okay to the point where it holds a pretty secure place in Peak 2. And yeah, the Jason Nevins remix of Rockstar goes hard as well. Shifting back to pop punk now, and this time we have the Big Boys. It's the band from the American West Coast, fronted by a bassist with the initials MH, and featuring a guitarist named Tom. Of course, I'm talking about the one and only MxPx.
1, 2, 3, go!
Hey, what's up? This is Yuri from MxPx, and you're listening to EA Radio Big.
In 1992, 3 high schoolers from Bremerton, Washington formed a band called Magnified Plaid, a name too big for most gig posters, so on one poster they shortened it to MP, with tiny X's after the letters instead of periods, which led to people reading it as MxPx. I'd say that was for the best really, because what the hell kind of a name is Magnified Plaid? And secondly, how do they think people that didn't already know the band would react to seeing MP on a poster? If I saw that, I wouldn't be sure if it's referring to a band or Anthony Albanese doing his DJ sets again. The guy with the MH initials is Mike Herrera, and those piercings make me think that if you tried to make out with him, you'd end up looking like Heath Ledger's Joker. Then you have one of the greatest band member contrasts I've ever seen, as drummer Yuri Ruley looks more like he has to take annual leave from his accountancy firm to tour with the band. But getting more into the music, MxPx started out with maybe some more hardcore punk leanings, but by their 6th album, Before Everything and After, these guys were more than ready for the big time. They played the Warped Tour several times, supported almost every major pop-punk band you can think of, and even covered the Scooby-Doo theme song for the first live-action film. MxPx is so clean that they've often been labelled as a Christian punk band. Whilst Herrera has become more of an agnostic recently, and from what I can gather was never really much of a preacher anyway, this album is pretty safe for a Christian household. It's like Green Day without the politics, or Blink-182 minus the gross-out humour. First time I heard the album, I was like, oh yeah, it's pretty good, you know? The second time I heard it, I was like, I'd put the track Quit Your Life as one of my favourite songs in the album initially, but when I came back to it, I was like, God, this is so sappy, you could bottle it up and pass it off as maple syrup. But I have gone back to liking this album again for sure. There certainly aren't any hidden depths to these MxPx songs, but guitarist Tom Wisniewski has some decent variation in his playing, and Herrera's shortcomings as a songwriter are largely covered up by his knack for delivering solid vocal lines. Some of the vocals are a bit more saccharine than the rest, but even when the album isn't quite as good, it doesn't give me the same sense of disappointment I get with that Autopilot Off album. There's a sort of naivety to this album, but in a way that feels genuine and somewhat charming as a result. In the grand scheme of things, Before, Everything and After is a little bit crap, but I can't bring myself to dislike these guys too much. If Play It Loud is definitely your kind of song, then this should be your kind of album too. Even if Play It Loud is ultimately light years ahead of the other tracks. I guess one of the tracks pretty much describes how I feel about the album. It's alright. Now, I don't know what the Greek goddess of love has to do with drum and bass, but next up we have Aphrodite.
How about some Aphrodite, y'all, just to make, another perfect day just that little bit better?
Aphrodite, or Gavin King, as his mum would have called him whenever he was in trouble, was no stranger to the SSX series at this point, with his song Drop Top Caddy appearing in the first SSX, and King of the Beats appearing in SSX Tricky. For a long time I thought that King of the Beats was just Drop Top Caddy with different vocal samples. It isn't, but I guess when you're focusing on the gameplay you might overlook a lot of those differences. On some songs from his second full-length album Aftershock, you can even hear the same bass preset that he used on King of the Beats and Drop Top Caddy, which predates this album by 6 years. So there's a pretty clear blueprint to the Aphrodite sound. And I wasn't too confident going into Aftershock, as I never really cared for Wobble or either of those other Aphrodite songs that I mentioned that much. But my experience with drum and bass outside of this album basically amounts to hearing a few pendulum songs, so I didn't truly know what to expect from this. Turns out, Wobble's actually kind of decent, so maybe it just doesn't quite match the vibe of SSX3 for me. And the rest of the album's pretty decent as well. I was worried it might get a bit boring, because it's another album in the 70-minute range, but I never feel particularly restless whilst listening to this album. I guess there's just enough variety to keep the album engaging. Most of the tracks are like Wobble, with that shuffling programmed beat and a bouncing bass line, but sometimes there's more atmospheric synths thrown into the mix. The song Be With Me doesn't even have that amen break type rhythm at all, and it's a mid-tempo track, closer to Portishead than Pendulum. Aftershock also has roots in jungle, a reggae-influenced genre that would soon evolve into drum and bass, with vocal features from Jamaican dancehall veteran Barrington Levy, and a guy known as Deadly Hunter, who on Ganja Man sings about the herb like it's the only thing keeping him alive. There's also solid features from American MCs Ra Digger and Big Daddy Kane, and British MC Wildflower, who says this after delivering her verses.
Oh, blimey.
That's the last track on Aftershock, by the way. The last thing you hear on this album is Core Blimey. Also, one of Barrington Levy's lines is shibbly waddly diddly. Surely those two things are worth Peak 2 status alone. Although you also have the track Kama Sutra, where Gavin was like, you know what this track really needs? Orgasm sounds. But I like it a little bit more after hearing the original version, which is actually more explicit than this remix. Aphrodite turned 33 in 2001, so he was nearly middle-aged when he dropped this. Anyway, Aftershock doesn't really have any stellar tracks, but it also stays engaging enough that I'd put it at least in lower Peak 2 for sure. I guess I much prefer a largely predictable drum and bass album than a largely predictable trance album. Now we go from a female deity to female royalty. Also an artist that is feminine, mostly in name only.
Here's a track from one of my favorites, Queens of the Stone Age, remixed by Uncle.
Josh Homme has been the only constant member of Queens of the Stone Age, formed in the late 90s after the dissolution of his prior band Caius, a band that made great songs like this.
You know that you can and will lick my do.
And this.
Yeah.
Homme has had some pretty notable bandmates over the years, to the point where Quatsa is almost a supergroup, especially when you look at the core lineup on their third album, Songs for the Deaf. Alongside Homme was ex-Caius bassist Nick Oliveri, former frontman of Seattle grunge band Screaming Trees, Mark Lanigan, and Dave Grohl on drums. His favourite thing to smash, aside from, of course, women that aren't his significant other. I first listened to Songs for the Deaf quite a while ago, and it wasn't purely because I knew of No One Knows from SSX3. When I first heard No One Knows on the radio, the only thing that made me realise it was the original version of that Uncle remix was the fact that Josh Homme sings the name of the song. Uncle basically just took Homme's vocals and built an entirely new song behind them. It's a unique remix, but not exactly a good advertisement for the rest of Quatz's music, is it? The roots of the band's sound are in stoner rock, a label often given to Caius with their thick, chugging guitars, throaty vocals, and overall bluesy melodies. A couple of Songs for the Deaf's tracks like Song for the Dead and First It Giveth have that classic stoner riffage, but then you have more of a bouncy thrash on No One Knows, the death waltz on The Sky Has Fallen, and the more light-hearted but insistent trucking rhythm of Go With The Flow. There's also the double punch of Do It Again and God Is In The Radio, which dials back the chugging a bit, but dials up the blues instead. Thankfully, Queens of the Stone Age do blues rock without managing to sound like truck commercial music. Homme has kept Queens of the Stone Age sounding multi-dimensional throughout the years via not just his explorative guitar playing, but via his buttery smooth vocals sweetening the listening experience for even their most instrumentally heavy songs. However, he only sings lead on half of Songs for the Deaf's tracks, with the late Mark Lanigan providing similarly soulful but slightly more ragged leads on 3 of the 14 tracks, and Nick Oliveri fronting 4 of the tracks. Oliveri starts off doing his best to shred his vocal cords on Millionaire and Six Shooter, before switching to quite pleasant singing on Gonna Leave You and Another Love Song, which bring a little bit more of a psychedelic pop feel to the album. And the album winds down with hidden track Mosquito Song, sounding a bit like a band of ghosts performing around a lonely campfire in the Californian desert. So Songs for the Deaf is a hell of a journey. It's an album that kicks your ass, but also apologises and sends you flowers when you're recovering in hospital. It's a stone cold stunner from the Stone Age Queens. Peak 3, no question. That covers all of the songs and artists that you probably remember from SSX3 the most. Now it's time for the remaining 12 albums that feature the songs that only played on backcountry and or freestyle events. And yet, after playing this game for a while, I felt like I heard this next song more often than some of the songs I've already talked about earlier. Whenever the Oakenfold remix of Glass Dance by The Faint came on while I was playing SSX3, my feeling was usually something along the lines of, oh, this again? The synths mostly just twinkle away and the tempo feels a little bit too slow. But the other songs of a similar tempo at least have a bit of pump to them, you know? And the lower frequencies on this remix just don't really drive the song at all. That doesn't help either. I did listen to the remix in my own time and felt like it was actually alright. So I guess my problem is less with the remix itself and more with the fact that it doesn't quite fit the gameplay of SSX3. So The Faint are a band from Omaha, Nebraska, founded by Connor Oberst, along with brothers Todd Fink and Clark Beckley. I mentioned Connor Oberst first because, you know, you've probably heard of him from, like, Bright Eyes and stuff. But truthfully, he was only in the band for about a year, and they only changed their name to The Faint after he left. Also, the reason that Todd has a different last name to his brother Clark is that he got married later on and decided to take his wife's name, which I wholeheartedly support in this case because Todd Fink is a fucking sick-ass name. The quickest summary I'd give of The Faint's third album, Dance Macabre, is that it's like if Duran Duran came from Sheffield instead of Birmingham, met the original iteration of the Human League, and they both bonded over their shared love of craft work. It's a slick approach to dance punk combined with a primordial approach to new wave. The album has a few prominent guitar licks from a guy that calls himself Depose, but it's keyboards that very much drive this album. From stuttering and bleepy leads like on Glass Dance and Your Retro Career Melted, to blaring walls of synth on the likes of Agenda Suicide and Total Job. By the way, The Faint's keyboardist for most of its existence, including on this album, was Jacob Thiel, who passed away in 2020. That fucking sucks. Clark Beckley contributes a mix of live drums with frantic hi-hat rhythms and pounding electronic beats that give even the not as fast tracks more of a lurching feeling. There's also liberal use of vocoders throughout the album. One of the initial notes I made after listening to the album was, I've never heard vocoded vocals with this much swagger before. And I stand by that point, so good job, me. Another one of my original notes was that I didn't really know what Fink was singing about, which is fairly fitting for a band that are also often labelled as electroclash, but it's apparent to me now that the lyrics of Dance Macabre are essentially just different flowery ways of saying that corporate life is hell. So there's a degree of escapism to the music, but it may also serve to highlight the thing that you're escaping from, which is partly why this doesn't feel like true electroclash to me. Plus, the Faint are first and foremost about the music, and not particularly interested in dance routines, unlike some of their peers. Yes, I'm looking at you again, Fischerspooner. Mostly Spooner, because I'm not even sure if Fischer took part in any of their live shows. At least not the ones that I saw videos for. But yeah, as you already know, I love Fischerspooner's album regardless, and unsurprisingly, I love this Faint album as well. Dance Macabre is 9 tracks totaling just over 35 minutes, making it the shortest album, directly linked to SX3, but it definitely makes great use of that comparatively brief time. They even managed to end on a slower track, largely driven by cello and piano, like a troubled nephew of Vienna by Ultravox. This album definitely makes me want to dance macabrely, or just thrash it out like the guy on the cover, who is Depose. He wasn't actually on the original album cover, but they had to change it because they used a photo of a guy that ultimately didn't give them permission to use it. Funny thing is, the photo of Depose fits so much better to me. This other picture just looks like he's trying to jump over a puddle. Oh, I almost forgot, yeah. This is going in peak 3, no doubt. On to the next album, and remember the Swollen members? Well, now they're back. In pop form.
This one's by request, the Swollen members going out to competitor Griff Simmons.
Heavy is the follow-up album to Bad Dreams, although 2002's Monsters in the Closet, which is more of a B-sides and rarities compilation with a couple of new tracks, is generally referred to as the third Swollen members album. One of those newly recorded tracks featured fellow Canadian Nelly Furtado, who would soon make her mark on pop history with 2 Billboard #1 hits. Swollen members unfortunately never came close to Furtado's level of worldwide success, but based on the sound of this album, it wasn't for lack of trying. This album shifts away from the underground sound a bit, with a greater focus on melody, and the tracks produced by Bad Dreams collaborator Nucleus, generally doing a syncopated thing that sounds like they were trying to match the vibe of Hey Mama by the Black Eyed Peas, or whatever that song's main influences were. Rob the Viking handles most of the album's production duties, though Evidence of Dilated Peoples also returns to produce 2 tracks, and All Night is produced by Christian Oldevolbers, a former long-serving member of Fear Factory. I still haven't fully gotten over the fact that this dinky-ass beat was produced by a certified metalhead. What's more, the beat to All Night is almost completely devoid of bass, which is strange enough for a rap song in general, let alone a party rap song, but mostly bizarre coming from a guy whose primary instrument is bass guitar! How do you just forget the bit in the music that pertains to your main job? For a long time, All Night was by far my least favourite song of the SSX3 soundtrack. And ultimately, it's still one of my lesser favourites overall. But once I started listening to this Swollen members album in full, I finally started to vibe with it, somehow. I'm still not particularly into hearing Madchild and Prevail rap about trying to pick up chicks at the club, but I am well past the point where I hated this song with every fibre of my being. Whilst I didn't really care what Madchild and Prevail was saying on Bad Dreams either way, on Heavy, I definitely care about some of the more eye-rolling lyrics. Mostly in relation to Madchild's newfound obsession with references to... Oh, you know what, I'm just gonna play the clips.
If you don't like it, suck this. I'm a cops could suck my cock or the recorder pounder while I'm getting my dick sucked. Suck my dick and here's a nutsack to swallow. Shut the fuck up, bitch, and suck my dick.
Okay, that last clip was actually from a Madchild solo single, but I wanted to bring it up anyway because it is heinous. Ew! Now to be a bit nicer, if these guys were actively trying to sound more radio-friendly on this album, then it didn't come at the cost of sterilising their beats for the most part. Also, Mocha Only was an official Swollen member at this time, though he would leave a couple of years later to work towards his goal of apparently being the buckethead of hip-hop. And Mocha Only is probably a lot of the reason why the album has a more melodic focus, as he delivers most of the hooks, but also lays down some smooth rap verses of his own, and that is definitely a more than welcome change. There's also a hook delivered by guest rapper Abstract Rude on the track Don't Know Why, and he delivers that over a beat that sounds inspired by Toccata and Fugue in D minor, of all things.
I don't know when the time will be, which side of me whom you might see.
The song Adrenaline even has the best Madchild hook that I've heard by far. So, yeah, ultimately, I guess pop rap is a slightly better fit for Swollen members, even though Heavy doesn't 100% abandon their hardcore hip-hop leanings. I think it's pretty cool that the Swollen members album that I've much preferred is the one that had much less outside help. But is that enough for the album to get a spot in Peak 2? Short answer, no. It's still an uneven album, with a bunch of tracks that aren't super distinct from each other, and a couple of prank call interludes that are maybe amusing for a couple of seconds, mainly because the old guy on the other end has the most Canadian accent I've ever heard, but they mainly just help make the album a bit longer than it needs to be. So Heavy is still going to go in peak 1, because the stronger hooks and more attention-grabbing beats don't hide the cringier lyrics and largely formulaic structures, but they do help make this album feel like far less of a slog than Bad Dreams. So I guess this time I'll say, well done, Swollen members. Good job? Now, all of the Swollen members' albums were released through Battle Axe Records, a label founded by Madchild himself. And Battle Axe seems to be the centre of a collective of rappers and producers that contribute to each other's tracks, including the group that we're about to look at now.
Oh, you need something to help you tackle the mountain? Here's a little Dilated Peoples for you.
Dilated Peoples are a trio of rapper and producer Evidence, MC Rakar Iris Science, and DJ Babu. So now you know who's who. So the Battle Axe connection here is that Evidence produced tracks on both of the Swollen members' albums that I covered, and all three of the Peoples featured on Bad Dreams in some capacity. Meanwhile, the third Dilated Peoples full-length Neighborhood Watch also shares 3 co-producers with those Swollen members' albums. Another one of the producers on Neighborhood Watch was the soon-to-be world-famous Kanye West on the track This Way, one of the trio's biggest hits. Kanye, of course, made the album Jesus is King and then retired from public life in his pursuit to be a good, wholesome Christian man. At least I assume that's the case. I can't be bothered to look him up. Now, Who's Who is one of the SSX3 songs that never hugely stuck out to me, so I didn't go into this album with super high expectations. And the first time I listened to the full album, nothing really stood out about it to be good or bad. A lot of the tracks sound like they were drawing more from G-Funk, whilst This Way greater reflects Kanye's soul and gospel influences, and Love and War does more of the chipmunk soul kind of thing with its beat. Whilst there's certainly energy in the vocal performances, the backing music generally has a bit of a chill factor to it, so that maybe partly explains why the album didn't really hit me on first listen. I get the impression that Dilated Peoples weren't really trying to make the best album ever with Neighborhood Watch, just an album that they could be proud of themselves. I feel like this one Evidence bar from the track Closed Session kind of sums up their philosophy. They don't just want to make money, they want to strengthen the rap scene at large, and they're not interested in starting rivalries in the scene. So they still do a lot of bragging, while also respecting their forerunners and their peers, giving shout-outs to the likes of Run DMC, Everlast, Be Real, and Madchild and Prevail. Yeah, Swollen members' raps often feel needlessly isolated and combative compared to Dilated Peoples' rhymes on Neighborhood Watch. Ultimately, there aren't any moments on this album that stick out as particularly mind-blowing, but it makes up for that by being fairly consistent overall, with no significant low points aside from maybe the last line of Phil da Agony's guest verse on Closed Session.
Dilated teeth, dick in your mouth.
There is also the line, she'll play your heart like Toys R Us, but that one is maybe so bad that it circles around to being great again. Then there's the final track, DJ Babu in Deep Concentration, which is his scratching and cutting showcase. Fair enough for one of the guys credited with popularising the word turntablist itself. But like the largely instrumental tracks on Revolutions by the X-Ecutioners, this one is just, kind of whatever. Still, there are a lot of pretty catchy tracks on Neighborhood Watch, even when their beats tend to be 1 or 2 bar phrases repeated for the entire 3 to 4 minute song. And amongst the album's somewhat passive nature, the song Big Business is their public enemy moment, with Rakar Iris Science taking on the US government and its war on terror. Even if it doesn't completely avoid cliches on this topic, it's got to be the track with the best overall wordplay for me. So I'd go ahead and say Neighborhood Watch is the best hip-hop album that I've covered for this video so far, but there are still a couple more to come. And it should be the last time that I mention Swollen members until the very end of the video, which is nice. So like I said, the album may lack any earth-shattering moments, but the quality is spread out fairly evenly across the whole thing. So it's comfortably going to be in peak 2. Up next, I mentioned this guy earlier in the video as a peer of the Chemical Brothers, but by the end of the 90s he became an even bigger international success than them. I'm talking about Fatboy Slim, and it's time to mostly look at his somewhat forgotten 4th album.
For all the SSX nutcases out there, here's a little Fatboy Slim.
It took many years for it to finally dawn on me why Mr. Slim called his second album You've Come a Long Way, Baby. It's because he'd come a long way. Subscribe for more valuable insight. A lot of people might think that this is the first Fatboy Slim album, but no, that would be Better Living Through Chemistry. And yes, the name is a nod to the Chemical Brothers. But before he even started calling himself Fatboy Slim, he already had a UK #1 hit. Back when he was still mainly known as Norman Cook, he was in charge of a short-lived ensemble called Beats International, who reached #1 in 1990 with a rework of a song written by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. And guess what? That wasn't even his first #1. In the 80s, he was the bassist for indie pop band The House Bartons, and in 1986 they topped the chart with an a cappella cover of Isley Jasper Isley's Caravan of Love. Considering that he'd eventually become known as a sampler extraordinaire, it's somewhat fitting that his biggest hit with a rock group was a cover song. Oh, by the way, he only officially changed his name to Norman in 2002. His birth name was Quentin Leo Cook. My life is a lie! Now, Fatboy Slim's third album was more of a modest success, at least compared to the success of You've Come a Long Way, Baby. But it has one of his best remembered songs in Weapon of Choice. And the album still peaked in the top 10 and shipped platinum in the UK. The same can't be said for his fourth album, Palookaville. It seems pretty apparent that Norman was in no rush to replicate his earlier blockbusters, considering that the debut of Don't Let the Man Get You Down on the SSX3 soundtrack predates the release of the album by almost an entire year, and it dropped almost an entire 4 years after his previous album. Cook later told Alexis Petridis of The Guardian that he didn't mind Palookaville's relative lack of success because it meant he didn't have problems with paparazzi anymore. Petridis also wrote that Palookaville sounded like an album made by a man who was sick of Fatboy Slim, and ending the album with a cover of the Joker by Steve Miller Band doesn't exactly scream ambitious to me. It comes as no surprise in hindsight that Norman more or less became a full-time touring DJ after this, with Palookaville remaining as the final Fatboy Slim studio album to date, unless you cover his 2010 collaboration with David Byrne for the soundtrack to a musical about Imelda Marcos that exists for some reason. Anyway, before I listened to Palookaville myself, I decided to give a proper listen to You've Come a Long Way, Baby first, and after finally hearing the full album in order, I can say that it definitely stands the test of time. Not quite as experimental as the Chemical Brothers stuff, but a great set of raucous, hooky dance tunes. In comparison, halfway between The Gutter and The Stars slowed things down a bit, and then this album dials back the overall intensity even more. So I can see how that would have deterred a lot of previous listeners, but is that an inherent problem with the music? Of course not. Don't Let the Man Get You Down has always been and always will be a banger. I think the SSX community is 50-50 on this song, but the other 50% is just a bunch of babies. Oh, it's too repetitive. Oh, high-pitched vocals. The follow-up track, /dash, is the closest thing to Rockefeller Skank on here, though I can hear why it might not have caught on. Because right about now, the Funk Soul Brother makes for a much better vocal loop than /dash./.com. Also, I don't think I'll ever be able to hear the main guitar line without thinking about Holiday in Cambodia. Still, it's largely jarring, but in a fun way, for sure. Track 3 is Wonderful Night, which sounded familiar to me when I first heard the full album, and that's probably because it was on the soundtracks of both Robots and Flushed Away. Two childhood classics right there. Wonderful Night is one of 2 tracks on Palookaville featuring Lateef the Truth Speaker, who's from California, but must have been encouraged by Norman to put the word Minga in one of his lines here.
Just start this calypso. It is fucking minging. Suck your dad.
Lateef's laid-back melodic rapping showcases less gritty hip-hop influences compared to Fatboy's earlier albums. But again, Wonderful Night is still a fun, bouncy track with a pretty nice main hook. Then 5th track, Put It Back Together, is a collab with Damon Albarn. So obviously that song was always going to be good. The song originated from Cook helping to produce Blur's similarly underrated, if not quite as polarizing, 2003 album Think Tank. Damon wrote the song in response to relationship issues that Norman was having with his wife Zoe Ball, who he separated from. Well, they separated 13 years later, so I guess the song actually did a pretty good job of putting it back together after all. Long Way From Home and Push and Shove are 2 of the more rock-oriented tracks on the album as well, as Fatboy Slim decides to do baggy Manchester cosplay for the first time. A couple of the remaining tracks do maintain the mix of cinematic grandeur and chaos that made Fatboy a superstar and helped define Big Beat, with Northwest 3 and Song for Chesh built around string orchestra loops and thundering drum beats. Going back to the idea that Norman Cook didn't go into making Palookaville with a whole lot of ambition, this becomes especially apparent when the last few tracks include a remix and a cover song. I have also seen Jingo Lo Bar referred to as a cover as well, but I think he just took the original recording by Babatunde Olatunji and overlaid it with more electronic percussion and fuzzy synths, which I'd call more of a remix. It still works well regardless, quite rhythm heavy and yeah, very punchy. But yeah, the closing track on Palookaville is The Joker, which is 100% a cover. The first of its kind on a Fatboy Slim album, in fact, which is probably the biggest indicator that Cook was running on fumes at this point. It's not exactly the most inspired choice of song to cover, but he did bring weapon of choice vocalist Bootsy Collins back for this one. Collins is also known for his work with James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic, plus for typically performing in outfits like these. So that should make for a pretty wild take on this song, right? Yeah, it does. Sort of. Barely. To be fair though, it does still manage to be its own thing, and I have gradually liked it more each time I've heard it, but it still leaves at least one major question. Who asked for this? Interestingly, the original version of The Joker came out in 1973, but it only topped the UK chart 17 years later thanks to appearing in a Levi's commercial. Which song did it prevent from reaching number 1? Groove is in the Heart by D-Light, featuring ad-libs by Bootsy Collins. So without knowing Norman's exact motivations behind this cover, that connection makes me think that it could have just been an in-joke all along. So if you come into Palookaville after hearing You've Come a Long Way Baby, like I did, then you may be in for a little bit of disappointment, like I initially was. But Fatboy Slim's production skills are still apparent on this album, even if it isn't demanding you to dance or take in the sheer spectacle of it all as much as his previous albums did. I don't think Palookaville was ever going to be lower than Peak 2, but it did overtake a few of these other albums that I initially would have rated higher than it. A couple of issues, like its largely repetitive nature, would stop me from sticking it in Peak 3, but this is going to be one of the best Peak 2 albums. And that brings us to the definitive example of an album that I probably never would have listened to in a million years if I wasn't making this video.
Okay, you know you want some. Here's the Black Eyed Peas.
Elefunk is garbage. Peak 1. Okay, obviously that's not going to be the entire review. But if it was, you probably wouldn't have been all that bothered, would you? No, I definitely gave this album a fair shake. And there were at least a couple of reasons to be optimistic going into it. Firstly, it does seem like back in the day, at least, will.i.am was genuinely more into liquid swords than liquid swords. Secondly, I never had any problems with Labor Day, it's a holiday, despite my opinions on the Peas' most popular songs. Hearing it as an adult, I'd be hesitant to even call it multi-dimensional, and Public Enemy already flipped this exact sample about 15 years earlier to much better effect. But it's definitely still fun for what it is. Labor Day is a little bit of an outlier on Elefunk though, because elsewhere, will.i.am's production is more like NERD than the Neptunes in terms of its scope. There's so much more instrumental depth on this album than I would have expected from the Black Eyed Peas. There's dark, rippling guitars that sound straight out of the Nancy Sinatra playbook, synths in the style of both G-Funk and P-Funk, one or two organ parts that might fit right in on a Caesar song, and I'm pretty sure one song even ends with a sitar lick. All these organic instruments mixed in with largely electronic drums may be why I feel like the music on this album has actually aged incredibly well. Now the lyrics, on the other hand, this is still one of the most bizarre cases of a song being changed due to offensive lyrics to me. Because normally if a song has to have its lyrics changed for radio play, you can tell which line had to be replaced. But Let's Get It Started still sounds like it was recorded first. Then, for the hell of it, they decided to change it to something more uncomfortable to people with disabilities. Which makes no sense, obviously. But yeah, Let's Get It Started flows so much better as a chorus than Let's Get Even the music on the original version doesn't sound right. Most of the harder hitting drum bits are missing, it's missing the cool flute lick that plays when Taboo starts his verse, and the pre-choruses sound especially unfinished. Maybe something to do with the lack of vocal layers compared to the final version. So yeah, it just fails at pretty much everything. Whereas Let's Get It Started is, honestly, an actual bop. That's right, I've found myself genuinely enjoying multiple Black Eyed Peas songs. Even the songs that I turn a blind eye to when I repeatedly heard them on the radio as a kid. Shut Up is a nice catchy rap rock number. Hey Mama suggests to me that they were actually able to make fun Latin-inspired songs at some point. And taking a song like Where Is the Love that name drops an organization known by 3-letter Ks, and calling the CIA terrorists into a worldwide hit is genuinely kinda hardcore. If only the music was a bit less shit. So that's the one single on Elefunk that hasn't improved to me over time. Just feels so overwrought while also managing to feel empty at the same time. Now, what are the songs on Elefunk that you probably don't know? Well, Hands Up isn't the most remarkable opener, but it does flip an old Mambo sample to pretty good effect. Oh, and here's an R word that they didn't get rid of. Smells Like Funk is one of the most instrumentally dense tracks on the album. Unfortunately, it also features 4 separate poop bars. And the lines that don't mention poop aren't much better either. So, if you can handle the P's repeatedly comparing themselves to body odors, then it's a pretty damn good song. And then the next track is the guys basically just rapping about their collective Latina fetish. Yeah, so if it wasn't already apparent, a recurring issue with Elefunk is that when the lyrics are bad, they are bad! Plus the Latin influence gets a bit out of hand musically as well on this track. By the 4-minute mark of this 6-minute song, you don't hear any of the P's themselves anymore. Instead, the last 2 minutes is a full-blown Latin pop instrumental with some disembodied vocals by a Costa Rican singer. The musicality's fine, but, like, what's the point of this? Did will.i.am even co-write this part of the song? Questions like that only serve to help make those final 2 minutes feel like a near eternity. And that song's immediately followed up by a song called Sexy, which is basically Latin girls if it wasn't so tasteless. Well, slightly less tasteless. Thankfully, Elefunk generally goes up from that point, as Fly Away finally gives Fergie another moment in the spotlight. That, combined with just being a solidly written R&B song, probably puts it in the album's top 5 for me. Fergie's vocal talents is one of the album's biggest assets for sure. With that being said, I did kinda get jump scared when she started rapping on the next track. Not that she sounds awful, I just wasn't really prepared for it. That next track, The Boogie That Be, has the kind of instrumental that probably should have been used for Smells Like Funk, cause this is stank as hell. It even ends with a full-blown psychedelic guitar solo. I never thought I'd be using those words to describe a Black Eyed Peas song, but here we are. And 2 years later they were making My Humps. Then you have The Apple Song, which is basically an Apple Diap solo track where he raps about growing up in poverty in the Philippines. Certainly can't fault the sentiment, and thankfully the music itself is nice and breezy too. That comes before the much more intense Anxiety, a rap rocker with music provided by the mope metal band of Last Resort fame, Papa Roach. And somehow this might be in my top 5 for the album as well. Then after Where Is the Love comes the hidden track Third Eye, a surprisingly well executed detour into dub reggae. So yeah, I got a lot of pleasant surprise out of this album. But which peak would I put Elefunk in? Well, it definitely could have had a shot at peak 2 if Latin Girls and Sexy weren't on here. And removing the line about old ladies shitting logs would have helped too. So it's still going in peak 1, even though it may have more noticeable high points than some of the albums that I put in peak 2. But against all odds, there are plenty of moments on Elefunk that go hard like morning wood in the morning. Or hard like a motherfucking boner. Or go hard statues. But the albums that I put in peak 2 tend to just be underwhelming at their worst. Meanwhile, this album at its worst has at least 1 foot in the friggin' abyss. Now we have my proper introduction to Placebo, a band that I've heard of for a very long time, but never heard enough of their music to really know what their whole deal is, other than alternative rock of some sort.
Some of my buddies over at EA turned me onto this band. Well, not really buddies, but this band rocks. Here's Placebo.
Brian Molko was born in Belgium to an American father and a Scottish mum, later moving to Scotland, then to Liberia, Lebanon, and Luxembourg, where he completed secondary school. After moving to London as an adult, he formed Placebo with Stefan Olsdahl, who was born in Sweden, but also spent a lot of his childhood in Luxembourg, and one of Stefan's Swedish friends on drums. Also, Brian is famously bisexual, and Stefan is gay, so yeah, don't tell Nigel Farage about this band. I don't think Brian needs another outrageous politician on his back right now. After I listened to Placebo's 4th album, Sleeping with Ghosts, I also listened to their first 3 albums, and well, how would I describe the Placebo sound overall? Well, I normally feel like alternative rock is too broad of a term to describe a band as a whole, but Placebo have dipped their toes into a bunch of subgenres without fully committing to most of them, like post-punk, post-hardcore, emo, noise rock, goth, glam, even a little bit of industrial on songs like Pure Morning. So to me, the Placebo sound really is just alternative rock, because it's too hard to truly break it down beyond that. I'd say art rock works too, because that and alternative rock can be pretty interchangeable. So true to that form, Sleeping with Ghosts has Placebo throwing many things at the wall and seeing what sticks, possibly to an even bigger extent than their prior 3 albums. Opening track Bulletproof Cupid is kind of a pop-punk instrumental with a grungy breakdown in the middle that feels kind of Smashing Pumpkins-esque. The Bitter End is a modern post-punk track that feels very in line with the likes of Block Party and Arctic Monkeys that broke through soon after, and nearly managed to bring Placebo themselves back into the UK top 10. Imagine if a newer band dropped this single. Then it probably would have been one of the biggest songs of the era. Plasticine has slightly more forceful guitars, though still very hook-oriented. Then when you'd be expecting some kind of instrumental solo in the bridge, it instead has Brian sounding like he's groaning from deep within a cave. So yeah, that's the art rock thing. Still very musical, just delivered in a way that you'll never be fully able to expect. And the most unpredictable track has got to be Something Rotten, which starts off like this Lynchian psychedelic number, punctuated by some glitchy synths and some lonely saxophone notes, and then it gets to the weird part, when the fuzz bass kicks in and is joined by an especially squelchy synth. Sleeping with Ghosts largely alternates between the punchy rockers, like some of the tracks I've already mentioned, and mid-tempo heartbreak ballads, like the title track, Special Needs, and Centerfolds, a piano-driven track that closes off the album on a fairly muted note. That seems to be Placebo's preferred way to end an album. See also the hidden tracks from their debut self-titled, and their third album Black Market Music. But not their second album, which ends on a hidden track called Evil Dildo, which might be their noisiest track ever, so it's actually quite good. But even on the slower, more brooding tracks, including Centerfolds, the band still likes to colour things up with atmospheric guitars or other unusual effects in the production. This is certainly welcome when Molko generally has a more straightforward approach to vocal lines, assuming that he comes up with all of those himself, because Oldstyle co-writes most of Placebo's songs as well. Molko clearly puts a lot of thought into the words, because he's good at coming up with unique lyrical couplets, but his vocals tend to not be all that melodically complex. In a Placebo song, you tend to get about 4 distinct vocal hooks at most. But this band makes their melodies count for sure. In the wrong hands, maybe some of these songs could end up feeling not all that different from something like Coldplay. And I actually like a lot of Coldplay stuff, so that isn't to say the songs don't have any merits. But thankfully, these songs also happen to be in pretty good hands. Sleeping with Ghosts is a strong album by a band that very rarely sounds like any other artists in particular. It's so well crafted, and it's grown on me enough that it would feel harsh not putting it at least towards the bottom of Peak 3. So I guess my experience with this album didn't have a bitter end after all. Coming up, I'll be covering another album that involves Brian Molko in some capacity, but now, whilst I looked at a British duo that took a lot of influence from Chicago House earlier, it's now time to look at an album by an actual Chicago House DJ.
What's up, this is Felix da Housecat, and you're listening to EA Radio Big. Peace.
Felix Stallings Jr., better known as Felix da Housecat, has carried the house music reputation of his hometown into the 21st century, through several remixes and standalone songs like Silver Screen Shower Scene, which somehow even managed to sneak into the UK top 40. He's also collaborated with artists like P. Diddy, leading to this ominous paragraph on Wikipedia that I seriously hope for his sake is extremely out of date. I don't know what would have hurt more for Felix, hearing all that news about Diddy come out, or hearing that rework of his song that David Guetta did. Now, the intro of his Wikipedia describes Felix as part of the second wave of Chicago House, though his breakthrough album Kittens and the Glitz sounds less like he's creating a new wave and more doing what the first wave was doing. This album sounds like it would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to make in the 80s, but in 2001 probably could have been made for less than 10 grand altogether. A couple of these tracks, including Silver Screen, feature French vocalist and producer Miss Kitten, one of the most influential figures of electroclash. Kittens and the Glitz certainly fits in alongside that scene with its 80s revivalism and through it being a concept album about the glamorous lives of famous people, and or sex culture, as AllMusic puts it. But Felix approaches this with a level of professionalism that a lot of artists associated with electroclash tended to actively avoid. A lot of the prevalent 80s influences on this album are pretty much played straight. Any abrasiveness tends to solely come from the overly analog nature of the synthesizers and electronic drums, though there is also a preference for gated reverb snares, which, when combined with the more distorted synth lines, brings a little bit more of an industrial flavour to the project. Happy Hour combines the album's light and dark sides with a more majestic and spacey synth line amongst the clanging drums and monotone spoken vocals, and What Does It Feel Like, the only guitar-driven track on the album, channels early 80s post-punk. There are also tracks that are mostly faithful renditions of house music minus the aggression, like Sequel to Sub, with its reverberating piano line and overall vibe of something that Madonna would have sung over in the late 90s or early 2000s, or Pray for a Star, featuring the rather Michael Jackson-sounding vocalist Harrison Crump, going especially for that 80s house sound. Some parts of the album go back even further to disco, with She Lives channeling late 70s Giorgio Moroder, glitz rock largely being built off of samples from an Italo disco song, and a direct cover of Magic Fly by French disco group Space. The one real slight I have against this album is that it's not always super transformative with its influences and or samples. In fact, the main riff in Silver Screen is just a straight copy-paste from this old synth-pop remix. I'm a little bit disappointed that that song isn't quite as organic as I initially thought, but if we let Daft Punk get away with this 4 years later, then I'm happy to give Felix a pass for this too. Harrison Crump returns with another smooth as hell vocal performance on Runaway Dreamer, which has its rhythm dictated by a keyboard pulse alone, as there's no drums on it at all. It's a surprisingly tender end to the album. Although the original version of Kittens and the Glitz ends with hidden track My Life Music, a solid if largely uneventful electro-funk track. Despite the album's clear conceptual framework, I don't really see it as much more of a collection of dance songs. But it's a pretty damn good collection of songs at that. It grooves, it thumps, and it sometimes snarks, all the while bringing some nice solid tunes. And if you're going to go full retro, then doing several different kinds of retro is a pretty good way of keeping things interesting. This is unquestionably an upper Peak 2 album for me. The only thing keeping it from Peak 3 is a lack of any potential all-time classic songs. But that's about as far as I could go to critique this album. And I don't think I'll have to worry about criticising this next album too much, because evidently, they don't care. What you think?
We are getting a lot of calls for this group. Here's the Audio Bullies.
Audio Bullies is a project founded by Londoners Simon Franks and Tom Dinsdale, who've put out 3 studio albums, the last of which dropped back in 2008. Sometime later, Franks was apparently performing Audio Bullies shows without Dinsdale. I hope that he was billing those shows as just Audio Bully, with an IE instead of a Y, of course. But Simon and Tom have been working together again since around 2023, which may have been inspired by the 20th anniversary of their debut album, Ego War. We Don't Care was the album's breakthrough single, a brash thumping house number, and not the greatest thing on this soundtrack, but certainly dumb fun at the very least. Unlike the David Guetta song that samples it. For God's sake, David, leave my childhood songs alone! Ultimately, the album does match the vibe of We Don't Care on some of the other tracks, but certainly not all of them. I've seen the term hip house used to refer to this album, and I feel like that's the perfect term for it, because it's got hip-hop elements, and it's got house elements, but it doesn't stick to either of those things exclusively. Typically, the bass lines on Ego War are fuzzy and very club-friendly as a result, though the lead melodies tend to be played in synth tones that you don't hear too often in EDM, or by choppy horns and other old-school cut-up samples. And the drum beats tend to be more akin to UK garage in their syncopation and overall busyness, though We Don't Care and a few other tracks are still built on the more standard 4-on-the-floor pulse. Outside of the track Faced in a Cloud, which is essentially a remix of an early Joe Cocker single, Simon Franks is the designated singer and rapper on these tracks. When you combine the musical elements that I've already mentioned with Simon's proper nutty geezer vocals, you might immediately be reminded of Mike Skinner, aka The Streets. But I would say that Franks is definitely the better singer of the two.
I don't know why I said that so confidently when I've only heard a handful of songs by The Streets. Anyways, if Simon Franks is better at singing than Mike Skinner, then it's ultimately not saying all that much.
And he sings surprisingly often on Ego War, even usually going for more of a smooth R&B style rather than the football hooligan type thing like on We Don't Care. That's a pretty bold move for a guy with a fairly limited vocal range, yet he manages to deliver nice sounding hooks more often than not. I guess he's at least good enough at carrying a tune that I can overlook many of his vocal imperfections. For example, take this high note from the track 100 Million. Objectively, it's pretty terrible, but I guess I find it kind of endearing. Maybe a smoother, pitch-perfect vocalist could have improved these songs from a purely musical standpoint, but then it probably would have come off sounding much less genuine. Unlike with The Streets, I get the feeling that Audio Bullies didn't intend for the lyrics on Ego War to be on the same level of significance as the instrumentals, but I can tell that Simon at least put some effort into them. Plus, they're certainly personalised. I mean, he even name drops himself at one point.
Simon, it's time to get a job. Simon, what you mean? I've got a plan, it will all be clean.
So there's tracks like that about Simon's struggle to get where he was, witnessing other people struggling with things like the snow. Something tells me he's not just talking about frozen water that fell from the sky there. but there aren't many lyrics to go off of in that song, so who knows really. There's also a few declarations of love and promising to self-improve in the name of it. Again, there's at least an attempt at lyrical depth here, if not a resoundingly successful attempt. Now there's a hidden track at the end of the album after about 4 minutes of silence, but without that silence, Ego War is roughly 56 minutes of music in total. If I was watching this video as someone who'd never heard Ego War and just listened to me describing the music on it, then I'd suspect that the album would outstay its welcome before it's finished. Instead, I found the album to be surprisingly enjoyable. I don't think there are any must-hear tracks on it necessarily, but it stays fun in an off-kilter way, with a few breather moments sprinkled in, and yeah, the overall quality is pretty consistent. So Audio Bullies are going to go in peak 2. Definitely around the centre, if not in the top half. Next up, we have another perfect fit for a snowboarding game soundtrack, Snow Patrol. No, not the band, it's a song called Snow Patrol. And the band also fittingly happens to be called Alpinestars. Surely David Guetta didn't do a rework of this song, did he? No, he didn't? Alright, good.
You know, it's always a good time for some Alpinestars. And here they are.
Glyn Thomas and Richard Woolgar named themselves Alpinestars on the day of their first live show together, after the brand of Glyn's mountain bike. From what I can gather, the Alpinestars company never threatened legal action against them, though I guess EA Sports split their name into 2 words in the game just to be safe. The Manchester duo dropped their first album on indie label Faith and Hope. Basic is a fitting title because that might be the most clip art ass album cover I've ever seen. It did get a re-release with better cover art though. In 2000, Alpinestars remixed the Placebo single Taste in Men, which eventually led to Brian Molko singing on a track from their second album, White Noise. That album originally came out on a different indie label called Riverman Records, though it also got some extra distribution from Virgin Records and Astralwerks. So now with major label acknowledgement, a song licensed by Electronic Arts, and all 3 of White Noise's singles cracking the UK Top 100, things were looking up for these guys. But things did not, in fact, go up from here. Instead, we're left with the biggest what if out of all of the artists on the SSX3 soundtrack. The old Alpinestars website announced in early 2004 that they were working on their 3rd album, but by the end of that year, the whole site had just vanished. That's despite said 3rd album apparently being recorded in 2005, or slated for release that year, but the album is yet to officially see the light of day. And either the announcement of Alpinestars' breakup has been lost to time, or Richard and Glyn just quietly stopped working together and no one noticed. There are a couple of Alpinestars remixes that released after their supposed split, but they're credited to Richard alone. After those remixes, he seems to have retreated from the music industry, and to where? I can't be sure, because it turns out the name Richard Woolgar is a lot more common than I expected. Glyn also made some music in the late 2000s under the name Lucian Kane, and I do have a more recent update about him, but before I get to that, let's get more into this Alpinestars album. The album kicks off with Snow Patrol Part 1. Yes, it's actually a song in 2 parts. The game just lists the song as Snow Patrol, because they use snippets from both parts, though I don't think the snippets from Part 2 come up anywhere near as often during gameplay. So if you have childhood memories of this song, then there's a good chance those memories are of Part 1 exclusively. I do have vague memories of hearing this song in the game as a kid, though I guess it didn't resonate for me as much compared to other songs on the soundtrack. But nowadays, I'd call it the best song in the entire game. And this time I'm being serious. That squirmy lead melody, the way the vocals sound just slightly robotic in the chorus, the softer vocals and twinkly synths in the verses, it all just comes together masterfully. Snow Patrol Part 2 is great as well, reprising stuff from Part 1 in a more mellow way, and also introducing some new melodic elements, so it absolutely stands out on its own too. Compared to Alpinestars' debut album, which was basically electronica with occasional guitars, White Noise is closer to a 50-50 balance between synths and guitars. The first kind is the more airy tracks like Lovecraft, New Ice Age, and Brotherhood, where they blend largely acoustic guitars with synth strings and other bleeping and burbling keyboards. And when I say airy, I mean both spacious and portraying a sense of lightness, and reminiscent of Air, French band. The second kind is closer to fellow Mancunians New Order, who were also becoming a bit more rock-oriented around this time. That better categorises tracks like New Sex City, sorry, I'm just saying it how it's written, with its Nile Rodgers-y funk guitar, the shimmering electro-disco of Vital Love Disciple, and Carbon Kid, the song featuring Brian Molko. And while he didn't co-write it with Thomas and Woolgar himself, it does carry that vaguely industrial feel which Placebo started incorporating at the turn of the millennium. They also go all out on rock with the bonus track Smash It Up, which is not a cover of the classic punk single by The Damned, but it's a Manchester-style dance rocker with crunchy guitars, squealing feedback, and Thomas and Woolgar calling for some speed. Carbon Kid was the most successful single from the album chart-wise, putting Alpinestars within 13 places of the UK top 50. That's interesting because I feel like there isn't a whole lot to the song, especially as a single. Initially, I also didn't think the whole album had much to offer outside of Snow Patrol, but this is another album that eventually became rewarding to me after repeat listens. Same with Palookaville by Fatboy Slim, but on an even bigger scale. I don't know exactly what kind of keyboards Alpinestars were using on this album, but it sounds like there were at least a couple of Moogs. Certainly the kind of keyboards that you could heavily modulate the notes with the kind of modulation that you probably wouldn't get from a DAW alone in the early 2000s. So there's definitely some analog elements to this album that otherwise sounds digitized, helping things sound pristine without also coming off bland. And the music just has this pleasant aura around it that keeps even the least enjoyable tracks from being anything less than moderately fun. At least that's what I'd say. A few reviewers from back in the day might strongly disagree with that. Looking at contemporary reviews of the albums in this video has convinced me that the early 2000s were the true nadir of professional music reviews. A time when many writers felt that being an insufferable prick made for a better review of an album than giving it credit for its positives. That description is mostly directed at Pitchfork reviews of the time. Even their reviews of Melody AM and Songs for the Deaf had a bit of snark in them, and they both nearly scored 8 out of 10. You know what score they gave White Noise in their review? 2.9.
Oh, that's not very nice.
The review starts off by going after the lyrics, which are pretty secondary in fairness, so I can't push back on that too much. But I will push back on the fact that the reviewer mentions Brian Molko after referencing Carbon Kid, only to attribute him to a song that he had nothing to do with. Then it's one thing to claim that the album's derivative of its influences. It's a whole other thing to portray playing a major third on an acoustic guitar as shamefully ripping the melody of Here Comes the Sun, or that having a major fourth progression qualifies Burning Up as stealing outright from New Order's Temptation. Even the jury that sided with Marvin Gaye in the Blurred Lines lawsuit would have thought that comparison was reading into things too much.
It occurred to me after recording this that the song Size 9 from Alpinestars' first album has a vocal line that blatantly lifts the chorus melody from Ceremony by New Order, and they didn't credit anyone from New Order as co-writers. It makes that Temptation comparison even funnier to me because Alpinestars did steal from New Order, just not on this album as far as I can tell. Also, I didn't initially think much of comparing the song Hotel Parallel to Primal Scream, until I remembered that the Primal Scream album that they're referencing here is the one that's heavily inspired by the Rolling Stones and like blues and country stuff. So this review must have been written in an alternate universe where the Rolling Stones got Gary Newman to produce one of their albums in the 80s.
There's also NME, who largely dismissed the album because it wasn't full of thumping house music. I know, right? An album that isn't tailor-made for your specific interests? How selfish of them! We should all be more like AllMusic, who compare the album to several other artists in its review and still give it an overall score of 4.5 stars out of 5. Making music with recognisable influences isn't a crime if you can turn them into entertaining songs. Snow Patrol alone was good enough to put this album into mid to upper peak 2 alone, but now that I can fully appreciate the album, White Noise by Alpinestars is solid peak 3 material. Now before I move on to the next album, I'm going to go back to Glyn Thomas, with something that I would have mentioned before the review, but I felt like it might have killed the mood a bit. You see, I found this guy underneath the Snow Patrol music video, who says he contacted Riverman about the possibility of the third Alpinestars album being released someday, and apparently a Riverman rep told him that Thomas had unfortunately passed away the year before. Now I don't see any reason to believe that he would make something like this up, but I wasn't going to state this as a fact just based on YouTube comments alone. So I did a little googling and found this review from November 2023, which compares a French singer-songwriter to the work of Lucien Cain. But more importantly, opens with the writer pointing out that he was still dealing with the recent loss of his great friend, the man behind Lucien Cain. And no, there isn't even a passing mention of Glyn Thomas's death on Wikipedia, otherwise I already would have shown it. Naturally, none of the more widespread music news sites have reported this either, since they haven't touched Alpinestars in over 2 decades, if they ever touched them in the first place. I'm not even sure that this blog post here would qualify as a good enough source for Wikipedia, but it's the best source that we have, and likely ever will have for this. Finding out that Alpinestars fell so far off the map that one of them died 2 years ago, and basically no one knows about it in the first place, let alone that he took his own life. It's just devastating. But to end on a more positive note, based on those YouTube comments, there is at least a near finished version of the third Alpinestars album that could be released one day. Granted, that update was also as of 1 or 2 years ago, but there is at least a non-zero chance of the world at large hearing Time Spent with Machines eventually. Now on to the next album.
Today's conditions call for some Thrice. Enjoy.
Similar to Alpinestars, Californian rockers Thrice hastily named themselves before their first gig, after a bad in-joke. At least the resulting name is fairly innocuous, unlike a couple of the bands that we covered earlier. Thrice have a long history of promoting charitable fundraising, even donating a percentage of the sales from their initial albums to charities directly. That was even the case for their major label debut, The Artist in the Ambulance. Thrice's music is most often labelled post-hardcore, and when I hear that term, my mind goes to bands like Fugazi, At the Drive-In, The Dismemberment Plan, Unwound. So yeah, that generally tends to get my attention. However, the genre has evolved to the point that the album with the Life is Like a Video Game song is apparently post-hardcore too. I'm not going to say the name of that band, or the name of the guy that fronts them, because I know that he likes to try and sue people, but yeah, fuck him. So that, along with the air of pretentious early 2000s emo in some of the longest song names, gives some reason to go into this Thrice album with a bit of caution. Although I only picked up on the song name thing in hindsight, and I also wasn't really hesitant to listen to this album at all, because Stare at the Sun bangs. It's unfortunately quite an underused song in the game. And on top of that, EA accidentally made the song slower when they programmed it in. The same thing also happened to Autopilot Off, but in the opposite direction. So here's how those two songs actually sound versus how they sound during gameplay. There you go. If you're sick of seeing all these sped up and slowed and reverb versions of songs getting released, then blame EA Sports, because evidently they started it. But back to the album, The Artist in the Ambulance arguably has more in common with metalcore than hardcore, at least in some ways. Full of palm-muted guitar riffs and drop C tuning, with lead guitarist Tepe Teranishi throwing in some quite rapid noodling in parts, and frontman Dustin Kensrue spends almost as much time doing unclean vocals as he does conveying a melody. Shout out to Eddie Breckenridge on the bass as well. Just that verse riff in Stare at the Sun alone is elite. Look at his fingers! Look at them! There isn't a whole lot of dynamic range to the recordings, which isn't hugely surprising for a punk-adjacent album from the 2000s. Just look at the waveforms. You can see the brief moments where there's just a bass line or guitars, or Dustin singing on his own. But when the whole band is playing together, yeah, it's pretty much only in the red. That might be a large reason why Thrice did a re-recording of the album for its 20th anniversary. However, I don't feel super compelled to go and listen to the newer version, because this original version still rips pretty fucking hard. Any of the songs on this album could have slotted right in alongside the likes of Atreyu and Funeral for a Friend on the Burnout 3 soundtrack. But I can't imagine any of the tracks apart from Stare at the Sun fitting in SX3. In fact, it's a song about being so lost in life that you'd risk blinding yourself from looking directly at the sun, just on the remote chance that it brings the answers to you. Pretty heavy stuff compared to the rest of the soundtrack, both musically and lyrically. Stare at the Sun is one of the few tracks on The Artist in the Ambulance that stays overly tuneful while also rocking the fuck out. Another being lead single All That's Left. There's also a couple of tracks that incorporate a strings section, including The Melting Point of Wax, which has a more spaced out main riff that suddenly approaches Deftones territory. Beyond that, once you put on the album and hear the first 30 seconds of opening track Cold Cash and Colder Hearts, you've already heard most of what this album has in store. I'm not trying to say that's necessarily a bad thing at all. It just makes it harder to cover the album in more depth, where many of the tracks aren't super distinguishable from each other. Thrice have become known for experimenting with a bunch of different styles of music, but that didn't really start until the album after this one. Also, the choruses of the last two tracks sound like they're about to reprise Stare at the Sun before becoming more original after a couple of notes.
To
Beyond that though, calling The Artist in the Ambulance samey is more a comment on the overall sound palette, not so much about the quality. Because you put all these tracks together and you've got a damn fine album. If you're not a fan of metalcore, then I wouldn't really say that I am either. But if this qualifies as a metalcore album, then it's pretty fucking good metalcore. The Artist in the Ambulance maybe just sneaks into Peak 3, but it's a Peak 3 album regardless. This album puts the force in tour de force. And maybe it doesn't have that many tricks up its sleeve, but it pulls off those tricks expertly. The penultimate album I'm reviewing here is the oldest album by quite some distance, with a song that was remixed exclusively for SSX3 by the X-Ecutioners. I don't think this remix has played in the game very often for me at all, and frankly, I don't think I've really been missing out. And this is another one of the albums that I probably never would have put on if it didn't meet this video's topic.
Well, here's a perfect riding combination. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, remixed by the X-Ecutioners.
When most people think of Red Hot Chili Peppers, they think of Anthony Kiedis, Michael Balzeri, that's Flea, John Frusciante, and Chad Smith. But when Kiedis and Flea formed the band in 1982, they were joined by guitarist Hillel Slovak and drummer Jack Irons.
I don't think he was living up to his name much in those days. Get it? Because they rarely wore shirts. Thank you very much, I'm here all week.
Whilst the band's early to mid-80s output often gets overlooked, probably for good reason in some cases, it was Slovak who got Flea to start playing bass in the first place, so he's definitely pivotal to the band's story. Sadly, Slovak lost his battle with heroin addiction in 1988, and the death of his bandmate and close friend led to Irons quitting the band soon after. This easily could have spelled the end of the band for good. But within a year, Kiedis had largely kicked his own heroin habit and helped put together the definitive Chili Peppers lineup. Mother's Milk was Smith and Frusciante's first Chili Peppers album, with its Stevie Wonder cover being the first single to truly put the band on the map. I had certainly heard Higher Ground by the Chili Peppers in the past, but I guess not all that closely. Because man, this thing fucking rocks. You've got Frusciante doing these chugging power chords, as well as a deep rhythm part that I guess is filtered through a talk box. So there's pretty damn cool guitars, and the rest of the band are firing on all cylinders as well. Shout out to the little double-time hardcore punk coda too. Reading about this album, it seems like Frusciante's thicker riffs were done at the behest of producer Michael Beinhorn, with the whole band clashing with him and instead turning to Rick Rubin to produce their next album. One Mother's Milk track in particular is closer to the signature languid style that Frusciante is now known for, and that's Pretty Little Ditty. Yes, the one that the guitar lick from Crazy Town's Butterfly is from. This album's best remembered for Higher Ground and an interlude that gave a forgotten rap rock band 95% of its income. Not the biggest draw cards as far as Chili Peppers albums go, but let's get more into the remaining songs here. Good Time Boys opens the album with aggressive funk riffing, Kiedis' rapping, and a shouty gang vocal chorus, akin to their previous album's opener Fight Like a Brave. That prior album was also produced by Michael Beinhorn, so Good Time Boys sounds like a hangover from the Slovak era. Though like on Higher Ground, those funk riffs are played through heavy metal distortion this time. Third track, Subway to Venus, is straight funk rather than funk metal for the most part, complete with a prominent brass section. Then most of track 4 is a galloping one-note bass line over Smith's militaristic snare rolls, as Kiedis and Flea rap in unison about having a supernatural penis. Yeah, I'm obviously joking, because it's called Magic Johnson. Yeah, get it? No, it's about basketball, of course. And I'm not quite prepared to break everything down about track 5, Nobody Weird Like Me, so I'll just say that it does a pretty good job at living up to its title, and is all the better for it. Knock Me Down is an extremely catchy rumination on Slovak's death and dealing with drug addiction in general, with especially awesome backing vocals from Vicky Calhoun, whoever that is. And how come I don't know who she is? She should have been a star! Then Taste the Pain kinda combines the approaches of Good Time Boys and Knock Me Down, with some strong psychedelic elements in the verses. But the first real sign of a downturn comes on a song called Stone Cold Bush. It does have some more great funk metal riffs, but I did not need to hear Anthony Kiedis say suck that cock, and especially didn't need to hear another frigging loop porn sample. The next track is fine though. It's a Jimi Hendrix Experience cover, which they included on the album as a tribute to Slovak since it was recorded 2 years earlier. First time I heard it, I assumed it was a live recording, but no, it was another studio recording with Michael Beinhorn that just sounds a little more muffled and echoey for whatever reason. That's followed by a Pretty Little Ditty, and I'd say you could probably turn the album off after that song, because then you have the deceptively named punk rock classic. Not deceptive because it doesn't sound like punk rock, but because it sure as hell ain't a classic. And the last two tracks basically just retread stuff from earlier on in the album without being anywhere near as melodically memorable. Also, if your interest is piqued by seeing a song named Sexy Mexican Maid, then you should probably be on a list. Another odd thing that I haven't mentioned about the album yet is how much of it is other people's songs. And I don't just mean having two covers on here, because they're good covers, and personalised to boot. I'm talking about stuff like The Middle of Good Time Boys, which splices clips from 3 other songs in before resuming as it was before. They are samples of bands that Anthony does reference in the lyrics, but in a musical sense it's just like, why? The last track also starts with an off-key rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, although the rest of the song is apparently about the treatment of Native Americans, so I can at least see the irony with that. But what the fuck is Sweet Child of Mine doing on here? My prediction before going into this album was that it'd just be a competent attempt at what Jane's Addiction were doing around the same time. After all, Dave Navarro did replace John Frusciante for a few years in the 90s. To their credit, it's certainly more than that style-wise, and often much more than that quality-wise. I am glad that the band, and especially John, found their ideal sound and became superstars off it, but I do wish that they still beefed up their sound a bit, like they did on Mother's Milk. I am still going to put this album in peak 1, because of it falling flat towards the end. I mean, come on, Sexy Mexican Maid? Jesus. But I have mainly positive feelings towards this, which is another pleasant surprise. It'll probably still remain as the only Red Hot Chili Peppers album that I listened to, but yeah, it was a decent bit of fun in the end. That just leaves us with one more album to cover, featuring a song that I may have actually heard more often in SX3 than the Higher Ground remix, but when I revisited this game as an adult, I had basically no memory of how this song went. That's a shame, because Freeze by Chaos is a pretty damn cool song. But how about the rest of the album?
You know, everyone needs some chaos in their lives. Fortunately up here, there's more than enough to go around.
Toronto native Kevin Brereton, better known as Chaos, first started getting attention in the mid-90s, when he was dropping singles that I'd put somewhere between A Tribe Called Quest and Arrested Development. From 1996 though, Chaos didn't perform for 3 years, and basically retreated from the public eye in that time, as he pondered on what sort of musical approach was right for him. It then took another 3 years for Chaos to drop his debut album Exit, and the US would only receive the album the year after. Following an introduction by former NBA star John Sally, Chaos's one-time manager, Exit's first proper track, Fantastique, is less boom-bap than his early singles, instead using live drums, a clean guitar line, and wobbly synth parts that put it closer to the R&B flavoured rap rock of Ella Funk by the Black Eyed Peas. So on this track, Chaos is a bit more focused on melody compared to many of his other rap peers, but he still brings plenty of swagger. Next is Exit, Call Me, and... Sorry, did I somehow switch to an Usher album by mistake? That's followed by lead single Heaven Only Knows, with very minimal drums alongside acoustic guitar and piano. But it's still a rap song, and an almost cabaret-like rap song at that. So he's already tried his hand at a few different things, but he's not done yet, because track 5 is Superstar Part 1, a reggae song. Not even a rap song with reggae influences, just a straight reggae song. What style's the next track going to be in? Grindcore? Oh, actually, the track after that one is Freeze. So to summarise Exit by Chaos in one word, I'd say haphazard. That definitely isn't to say that Chaos doesn't know what he's doing though. He produced nearly every track himself, creating folksy guitar-based beats that are more or less his own thing, as well as some lightly funky electronic instrumentals that are solid as well. Plus he handles all of the melodic vocals himself, and he's a genuinely great singer. He kinda has to be on a song like Superstar Part 2, which basically strips any hip-hop and R&B elements and is just a chill rock song. And yeah, it's surprisingly awesome. So Chaos can do hip-hop and rock fairly well, but on Exit those two sides are largely separate from one another, which isn't great for maintaining a flow between songs. This is still at the very least a good album, but it might have been even greater if it was just a little bit more focused. Many of these songs are still reasonably impressive to me upon listening to them, but then they just haven't particularly stuck with me afterwards. I'm more than convinced that Chaos is very musically talented, but that's not always the only thing that you need to make a great album. Obviously, you've still got to make the songs work. The title track might be the only song that truly doesn't work though. Again, great singing, some nice string parts as well, but the song at its core is just not it. It's a little cheesy, but not in an egregious way. Ultimately, it just doesn't really stir anything in me at all. It just feels kind of hollow. Another thing is, when it comes to Chaos's rapping, the main theme that I notice in his bars is the feeling that rap isn't real anymore, or more specifically that modern MCs are more concerned about looking cool in music videos than the quality of their rhymes. Thank you, Genius Annotation. I guess it's a valid concern, and Chaos is decent enough when it comes to delivery and wordplay, but he's maybe not outstanding enough to make up for what I feel is a bit of a holier-than-thou attitude. The last track gives a possible indication of where things went a little bit wrong on the rest of the album. It's a remix of Heaven Only Knows, which puts the vocals over the top of the same sample that Ice Cube rapped over on It Was a Good Day, or a remake of the sample, I'm not 100% sure. I think the original Heaven Only Knows beat still works in a peculiar way, but I will say that the vocals do work a bit better over a G-Funk beat. In an interview from 2001, Chaos dismissed the music that he wrote in the 90s as pretentious and derivative of his influences. I don't think Exit completely escapes those issues, because it might have benefited from him being a little bit less self-conscious or uptight. To me, some of these tracks, especially the Heaven Only Knows remix, show that he can definitely fit more of an old school approach if he's up for it. Also, in that interview, he mentions the Fugees as an influence, and the less rap-oriented tracks on Exit do often come off a little bit like the miseducation of Kevin Brereton. I'm going to put Exit by Chaos in peak 1, but more in the could have been better sense, rather than the sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe shit sense, or the fucking boring sense. He does seem to have done alright for himself after this album, which is great, because again, he's definitely a talent, and even though it didn't entirely click for me, I hope that some of you watching this will at least give this album a chance. That's the album review portion over, so that means the video's nearly done. But it's not done yet, because now it's time to put all of those 31 albums back into my Big Mountain 3-peak tier list, and more importantly, in order from worst to best. So at the bottom of peak 1 and the bottom of my overall ranking, we've got Bad Dreams by Swollen Members. Not too far ahead of that, we've got Finger 11 self-titled. Next I'll put Deep Sky with In Silico, which was originally going to be the bottom album in my list, but I feel like I didn't give the music enough credit. It's just that it's too fucking long! Then we have the slightly better Swollen Members album, Heavy, and then the Black Eyed Peas with Elefunk, then Chaos with Exit, Autopilot Off with Make a Sound, and right at the top of peak 1, I'm going to put Mother's Milk by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, because it's really good when it is good, but it's also pretty bad sometimes. On peak 2, we're going to start with Aphrodite, Aftershock, followed by Andy Hunter with Exodus, then the X-Ecutioners with Revolutions, Ima Robot self-titled, Kinky self-titled, MxPx with Before Everything and After, which was originally going to be the bottom of peak 2, but yeah, it's grown on me a lot. Yellowcard with Ocean Avenue, Dilated Peoples with Neighborhood Watch, Audio Bullies with Ego War, NERD, In Search Of, Basement Jaxx, Rooty, Fatboy Slim, Palukaville, and at the top of peak 2, Felix da Housecat with Kittens and the Glitz. Now the big boys in peak 3. Just sneaking in is Thrice with The Artist in the Ambulance. Just ahead of them, Placebo with Sleeping with Ghosts, and just ahead of them, Jane's Addiction with Strays. Then I'm going to put Chemical Brothers with Exoplanet Dust, and just ahead of them, I'm going to put Alpinestars with White Noise. Nothing against the Chemical Brothers album, I just prefer this album more. Yeah. Now for the top 5 out of these albums. Number 5, it's going to be Caesars with 39 Minutes of Bliss / Love for the Streets. Number 4, Dance Macabre by The Faint. Number 3, Melody AM by Röyksopp. Number 2, Number 1 by Fischerspooner. Originally I think it was going to be like 5th in my ranking, but it's just got so many great songs, so I will definitely go into bat for this album. And if you don't like it, I don't fucking care. But it's not the best album in this video. That is going to have to be Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age. Brilliant. So, if you also have great nostalgia for the SSX3 soundtrack and hadn't already explored these artists on the soundtrack in more depth, then hopefully I gave you an idea of which of those artists are worth exploring. Of course, most of this video was based on my opinions, so don't be afraid to check out some of these albums just because I didn't have as many nice things to say about them. And if you feel like I could have said more about some of these albums, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the albums and what I think about them in the comments. Plus, did you disagree with some of my evaluations? Did you agree? Did you enjoy the video as a whole? Or not? Would you be open to more videos like this? You know, exploring albums by artists that appear on a particular video game soundtrack. It did take a little while to put this video together. I mean, I've been sitting on the first 2/3 of this video since July, but if the video does do well, I'd certainly be open to at least doing the same thing with the SX On Tour soundtrack. Then, maybe I'd look into a couple of the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater soundtracks. Probably not a Guitar Hero game soundtrack, because a video like this about one of those games would probably take 2 years to make. But yeah, I hope that this video on a niche musical topic was at least somewhat rewarding for you. Peace out.
Tremendously miraculous, astoundingly sensational. Quick, you better cancel your ego trip. Tremendously miraculous, astoundingly sensational. Quick, you better cancel your ego trip.